The 15th of March, 2025, and I'm just gonna get the volume up here. Early morning, I've been up for a few hours already. I was doing a deep dive into this video, documentary, whatever you want to call it, and so there's a few things in here that I wasn't tracking either, so this is really well done. It's a long video, that's why I'm starting it now, and so here we go.
Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, May 1998. John Miller, an ABC News correspondent who would go on to become the FBI's chief spokesman, ends an 11-day journey through the wilds of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. The first thing he notices is the rumbling of the generators providing the camp with power and the smell of gasoline. The second thing he notices is a hail of bullets. Bin Laden's convoy is arriving. Osama bin Laden is flanked by 7 bodyguards who, as Miller immediately recognizes, are simply there to put on a show. Their eyes darted in every direction for any attacker, he later recounted. This was either merely theatrical or entirely pointless, because with hundreds of rounds being fired into the air, it would have been impossible to pinpoint an assassin. Following the security detail into the hut, there Miller became one of the handful of Western journalists to interview the elusive Osama bin Laden.
We believe that the biggest thieves in the world are Americans, and the biggest terrorists on earth are the Americans. The only way for us to fend off these assaults is by using similar means. We do not differentiate between those dressed in military uniforms and civilians. They're all targets in this fatwa.
Miller has traveled halfway around the world to interview bin Laden, the reclusive terrorist leader who has just issued a religious fatwa requiring Muslims to kill Americans. But this interview, too, is just for show. Forced to submit his questions in writing ahead of time, Miller is informed that the answers will not be translated for him. There will be no follow-up questions. It is spectacle, theater and little else. As such, it is a fitting introduction to the man who would become the boogeyman of the 21st century. The interview was followed in short order by a more explosive drama.
What are your future plans?
You'll see them and hear about them in the media, God willing.
Car bombs exploded outside the U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam on the morning of August 7, 1998.
U.S. Navy officials in Bahrain today said suspected suicide bombers
badly damaged in a terrorist attack in Yemen.
American sailors were killed, injured, missing.
In Yemen today, the U.S.
Around the world, a frightened and confused public received their introduction to the Age of Terror on the morning of September 11, 2001, through the media. It was there, in the flickering images of their TV screens, that the masses began to learn about the world of Islamic terrorism and of the cave-dwelling Saudi exile in Afghanistan who was bringing that terror to their doorstep.
Tell us a bit about Osama bin Laden, what sort of resources and manpower and money he's got and what he's trying to achieve.
What is Osama bin Laden? Is he a politician? Is he a warrior? Is he a preacher? A little of all?
A little of all, I think, sir. He's a
millionaire Saudi businessman believed to be living in exile in Afghanistan.
He controls and finances Al-Qaeda, an umbrella network of Islamic militants.
He is a very soft-spoken man.
A man who is prepared to use overwhelming force in pursuit of his objectives.
He is the face that has been put on this by almost everyone.
A man of eloquence.
he has declared all U.S. citizens legitimate targets of attack.
Well, when I was in Afghanistan just a couple of days ago, I heard that he had
operations in at least 55 countries,
including last year's bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen.
The mastermind behind the bombings of 2 U.S. embassies in Africa.
In the last attack on the World Trade Center 8 years ago.
Bernard Lewis has called him almost a poetic speaker of Arabic.
Meanwhile, Osama bin Laden is a name that we have been hearing all day long as an individual who may, and we emphasize may, be responsible for these terrorist acts. It is a name we have heard before as well.
We all know the story of bin Laden and al-Qaeda, the story that was repeated ad nauseum in the days, weeks, and months after the catastrophic, catalyzing events of 9/11. So often was that story repeated that the hypnotized public forgot that it was, at base, just that. A story. In the ahistorical fable of TV soundbites, terrorism is a modern invention, created out of whole cloth by Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. And at the same time, Islamic fundamentalism is a force of nature, something that has always existed in the Middle East, the product perhaps of some sandstorm on the Arabian Peninsula in the distant past. But this is a lie. In truth, the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the modern era and the rise of terrorism as a political tool cannot be understood without confronting some very well-documented but long-repressed history. Ever since the mid-18th century, when the British East India Company gained dominion over the Indian subcontinent, the history of Islam as a political and cultural force has been intimately tied to the fortunes of empire and the aims of the Western powers. The British Empire in particular did much to shape the map of the modern-day Middle East and to influence the course of its religious and political forces. This influence can be seen throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Britain's gradual takeover of the Indian subcontinent led to the British Empire becoming, in the estimation of Winston Churchill, the greatest Mohammedan power in the world. The 19th century Great Game between Victorian England and Tsarist Russia for control of Central Asia saw the British propping up unpopular Islamic rulers throughout the region as a buffer between Russia and the crown jewel of the British Empire, India. Britain's desire to maintain its access to India led to the British conquest of Egypt in 1882, resulting in 40 years of British rule and a military presence in the country that was not removed until the Suez Crisis of 1956. From Khartoum to Constantinople, Jerusalem to Jakarta, no part of the Muslim world could escape the influence of the British crown. Sometimes that influence was used to strengthen the rule of Islamic hardliners. Sometimes, as with the modest rebellion in Sudan, that influence was used to put down Islamic uprisings. But in each case, the British Empire's goal was clear: to use whatever means at its disposal to undermine movements and governments unfavorable to its rule, and to install and encourage those forces that were willing to cooperate with the crown. This was evident in India, where George Francis Hamilton, Secretary of State for India, wrote in 1886 of the British strategy of using Muslim and Hindu divisions in the country to their advantage, along the lines of the old Roman imperial strategy of divide and rule. I think the real danger to our rule, not now, but say 50 years hence, is the gradual adoption and extension of Western ideas of agitation organization, and if we could break educated Indians into two sections holding widely different views, we should, by such a division, strengthen our position against the subtle and continuous attack which the spread of education must make upon our system of government. We should so plan educational textbooks that the differences between community and community are further strengthened. But perhaps no clearer example of the British Empire's role in shaping the modern Muslim world can be found than the story of the ascendance of the House of Saud and the formation of the modern-day Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Once again, British fingerprints can be found on every aspect of the story. When Britain began contemplating a shift from its centuries-long policy of supporting the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, it was Captain William Shakespeare, a British civil servant and explorer, who made the first official contact with Ibn Saud, the progenitor of the Saudi dynasty who would go on to found the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. In addition to taking the first photographs of the future Saudi king, Shakespeare became Ibn Saud's friend and military advisor, helping to steer the rising Arab leader away from alliance with the Ottomans and into a treaty with the British. Shakespeare died on the battlefield at Jereb in 1915, where the British-backed Ibn Saud was battling his Turkish-backed rival, Ibn Rashid. After Shakespeare's death, another British agent, Colonel Thomas Edward Lawrence, gained international fame as Lawrence of Arabia for his role in the Arab revolt against Ottoman rule in the Middle East. Although his own self-serving autobiography and the Hollywoodization of his story cemented in the popular imagination the idea that Lawrence was motivated solely by his concern for the Arabs and their independence.
We do not work this thing for Faisal.
No. For the English, then?
For the Arabs.
The Arabs.
The documented history of Lawrence's actions and motivations tells a very different story. A memo on the politics of Mecca, penned by Lawrence for his intelligence handlers in 1916, reveals a more duplicitous British calculus for supporting certain factions of the Arab revolt. The Arabs are even less stable than the Turks. If properly handled, they would remain in a state of political mosaic, a tissue of small jealous principalities, incapable of cohesion, and yet always ready to combine against an outside force. The alternative to this seems to be control and colonization by a European power other than ourselves, which would inevitably come into conflict with the interests we already possess in the Near East. Later, in a report on the reconstruction of Arabia Lawrence penned for the British cabinet at the end of the war, he was even more explicit about the cynical divide-and-rule tactics at play in British support for the Arab revolt. When war broke out, an urgent need to divide Islam was added, and we became reconciled to seek for allies rather than subjects. We hoped by the creation of a ring of client states, themselves insisting on our patronage, to turn the present and future flank of any foreign powers with designs on the Three Rivers.
Alliance. Or is it Major Lawrence?
Sir.
Ah. Hey. Well, General, I will leave you. Major Lawrence doubtless has reports to make about my people and their weakness and the need to keep them weak in the British interest.
Lawrence and the military and diplomatic personnel of the British Empire were indeed busy in the wake of World War I. In many ways, the aftermath of the war represented the zenith of that empire, and the culmination of centuries of British manipulation in the Middle East. Driven by a mixture of political necessity and imperial hubris, the imperial planners had entered into secret agreements that redrew the map of the Middle East and once again affirmed the centuries-old accusation that perfidious Albion was not to be trusted. In 1916, the British and French entered into a pact to divide up the territory of the Ottoman Empire between themselves should they win the war. This treaty, known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement after the diplomats who negotiated the document, was a direct negation of the web of promises that the British had already made on the land, including the territorial promises they had made to Ali ibn Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca who led the Arab revolt against the Turks, the Treaty of Dahran that had promised Ibn Saud British protection for his conquests in the Arabian Peninsula in return for his support in the war, and the Balfour Declaration promising the Zionists a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Although the revelation of the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement by the Bolsheviks in 1917 proved a considerable embarrassment for the British and French, it did little to hinder their plans. The agreement provided a basis for the ultimate partitioning of the Ottoman Empire after the war, and the national borders that it helped to create have gone on to shape a century of strife and political conflict in the region. But it was not enough merely to draw the lines on the maps that would define the post-war Middle East. The British had to shape the development of the region in its own interest, creating entire nations in the process. In the Arabian Peninsula, they came to pin their hopes on Ibn Saud, whose sole focus on the conquest of Arabia, they calculated, would counteract the rise of a broader pan-Islamic movement that could challenge Britain's supremacy in the region. As historian Mark Curtis writes in his book, Secret Affairs, Britain's Collusion with Radical Islam, the British government of India had feared British sponsorship of an Arab caliph who would lead the entire Muslim world, and the effects this might have on Muslims in India, and had therefore favored Ibn Saud, whose pretensions were limited to Arabia. The subsidy from the British upon which Ibn Saud relied in his quest to unite the peninsula, which stood at £5,000 a month at the end of the war, was raised to £100,000 a year in 1922 by then-colonial Secretary Winston Churchill. Churchill recognized that Saud's fighters, the Ikhwan, or Brotherhood of hardliners and adherents to the strict Wahhabi sect of Islam, were austere, intolerant, well-armed, and bloodthirsty, and, hold it as an article of duty, as well as of faith, to kill all who do not share their opinions and to make slaves of their wives and children. So why then did the British support Saud and his men? My admiration for Ibn Saud was deep, Churchill later confessed, because of his unfailing loyalty to us. That loyalty paid off well. The British were the first to formally recognize Ibn Saud's sovereignty over his newly conquered territory on the peninsula, and in return, Ibn Saud signed a treaty agreeing to stop his forces from attacking Britain's neighboring protectorates. In 1932, Ibn Saud became King Saud of the newly formed Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But even the nation's new name was British. It was George Rendell, head of the British Foreign Office's Eastern Department, who suggested it. The British played similar games throughout the region, arming, funding, and encouraging those who would work with them, including violent Islamic radicals, and undermining any potential challengers to British dominance. In Palestine, the British pardoned Amin al-Husseini, who had been sentenced to 10 years in prison for his involvement in the 1920 Jerusalem riots, and appointed him the Grand Mufti of Palestine, a title invented by the British, on condition that he cooperate with the British authorities. In Egypt, which became a British protectorate after World War I, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamist mass movement founded by Hassan al-Banna, was at times an explicit threat to the British military presence in the country. Nevertheless, its position as an alternative to both secular nationalism and communism, which Britain regarded as growing threats to its influence in the region, meant that the British were prepared to work with the Brotherhood against their common enemies, even covertly financing the group in 1942. In Iraq, the British, concerned at unrest in their Mesopotamian mandate, aided Prince Faisal in becoming Faisal I, King of Iraq. Faisal, recommended by T.E. Lawrence, guided at his own request by British advisors, and traveling at British expense, won a British-backed plebiscite to become the Iraqi king in 1921. The extent of British influence over the region during the post-war period was, in retrospect, staggering. But the number of machinations, manipulations, and shifting alliances that were required to keep this system of mandates, protectorates, and puppet governments going was a sign that the British were not all-powerful. On the contrary, their influence, and indeed their empire itself, was waning, soon to be replaced by the new rising world superpower, the United States. The US did not even wait until the end of the Second World War and the dawn of Pax Americana to begin its own diplomacy with the Muslims in the region.
An American destroyer comes alongside a cruiser in Great Bitter Lake on the Suez Canal in Egypt. It brings Ibn Saud, king of the 5 million people of Saudi Arabia, to a conference with President Roosevelt, stopping off here on his return from the Crimea Conference. The destroyer has been decked out with rare carpets for the monarch. This 800-mile trip marks the first time that King Ibn Saud has ever left his native land.
President Franklin Roosevelt's meeting with King Ibn Saud aboard the USS Quincy on Egypt's Great Bitter Lake in February 1945 was no ordinary exchange of diplomatic pleasantries. King Saud's first foreign trip involved a number of unusual requests and special arrangements. The Saudis insisted on bringing a contingent of 48 men, even though the Americans had said they could accommodate only 10. They insisted on sleeping in tents pitched on the ship's deck, rather than in the cabins provided. They insisted on bringing their own sheep, as the king believed that good Muslims eat only freshly slaughtered animals. But, irregularities aside, the meeting was momentous. Firstly, it demonstrated the importance of the Saudi-US relationship at a time when much of the world knew little and cared less about the happenings on the Arabian Peninsula. Secondly, it established the terms of that relationship, namely, a U.S. guarantee of military defense of Saudi Arabia, including Roosevelt's promise to do nothing to assist the Jews against the Arabs, in return for Saudi concessions, including allowance for U.S. airfields and flyover routes across the kingdom, and access to Darhan, where the California Arabian Standard Oil Corporation, which later became Aramco, had drilled the first commercially viable oil well in the country just 7 years earlier. And thirdly, it signaled the dawn of a new era. No longer was the British Empire the primary foreign power driving events in the region. From now on, one of the key foreign policy considerations of the Muslim world was the US, and its enormous military and financial resources. This changeover in world order was not instantaneous. For some time after the end of World War II, the US and British collaborated on operations that furthered their mutual interests in the region. These interests included opposing the rising threat of secular nationalist governments that, unlike the House of Saud and other Western-backed monarchies in the Middle East, were less pliable to bribes and more interested in nationalizing their country's resources. In March 1951, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the British oil giant that struck oil near the Persian Gulf in 1908, and offered the premiership of the government to Mohammad Mossadegh, an outspoken secular nationalist. Immediately after taking office, Mossadegh effected the nationalization, stating, "Our long years of negotiations with foreign countries have yielded no results this far. With the oil revenues, we could meet our entire budget and combat poverty, disease, and backwardness among our people." Another important consideration is that by the elimination of the power of the British company, we would also eliminate corruption and intrigue by achieved its economic and political independence. The nationalization put Tehran on a collision course with London. But Britain knew that a military intervention was not possible without American approval, and, despite harsh economic involved, that changed with the election of Dwight D. Eisenhower and the installation of the Dulles brothers, Director of Central Intelligence and Secretary of State, respectively. By June of 1953, the CIA was already adapting the British coup proposal into their own covert operation, dubbed Operation TP Ajax. An open secret in the world of intelligence, the CIA MI6 role in the overthrow of Mossadegh was officially denied by the US government for over half a century and is still unacknowledged by the British government to this day. Nevertheless, the CIA's own internal history of the operation, first revealed to the public in the year 2000, confirms the extent of the American and British role in the coup. They convinced the Shah of Iran to agree to the plan. They handpicked General Fazlollah Zahedi as Mossadegh's successor. They rolled out a propaganda campaign to portray Mossadegh, a devout adherent to democratic nationalism who rigorously excluded the nation's Communist Party from his government, as a communist sympathizer who would steer Iran into the arms of the Soviets. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars bribing journalists, clerics, and even Iranian parliament members themselves to go along with the plot. And they used a network of agents and suitcases full of money to incite riots and protests across the country. In the end, the operation was a success. Mossadegh was driven from power, General Zahedi took his place, the Western-backed Shah ruled the country with the iron fist of his feared secret police for the next 25 years, and a new agreement on sales of Iranian oil was reached. This time, though, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, now rebranded as British Petroleum, would not have a monopoly on the country's lucrative oil reserves. An international consortium was put together to share in the profits, with American companies Chevron and Standard Oil cut into the deal. But the eclipse of the old British Empire by the new American superpower became most obvious in Egypt during the Suez Crisis of 1956. Lying on the key spice and trade routes linking Europe and Asia, the importance of Egypt to the British Empire went back centuries. It was the British Navy under Nelson and the British Army under General Ralph Abercrombie that drove Napoleon out of the country during the French campaign there at the turn of the 19th century. But it was the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 that cemented Egypt's geopolitical importance for the British Empire. The Suez Canal, linking the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, and drastically reducing sailing distances from Asia to Europe, was technically the property of the Egyptians, but the project had been spearheaded by the French, and the concessionary company that operated the canal had been largely financed by French shareholders. An economic crisis in 1875, however, forced the Egyptian governor to sell his own shares to the British. As Parliament was not in session at the time of the sale, British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli had to turn to his close personal friend, Lionel de Rothschild, for the £4 million required to purchase the shares. After the British conquest of Egypt in 1882, an international agreement was signed declaring the canal a neutral zone under the protection of the British, whose troops were now installed in the country. This precarious balance of power lasted in various permutations for over 70 years. First under Britain's so-called Veiled Protectorate of Egypt in the decades leading up to World War I, then in a formal British occupation of the country during World War I and its aftermath, and then under Britain's unilateral declaration of Egyptian independence in 1922, which stipulated that the British would retain power over Egypt's defense and foreign policy. Britain's de facto control over the country was one of the grievances that gave rise to the Free Officers movement, a cadre of Egyptian nationalists in the ranks of the Egyptian armed forces who toppled King Farouk and took over the government in the Egyptian Revolution of 1952. One of the movement's leaders, Gamal Abdel Nasser Hussein, became president of Egypt in 1954 and began to implement a series of nationalist, anti-imperialist measures that, like Mossadegh, put him at odds with the British forces in his country. These measures culminated with Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal on July 26, 1956. The Suez Crisis led to a joint British-French-Israeli invasion of the country, but in this case, the US under Eisenhower declined to back the invasion. Instead, Eisenhower, still believing that diplomacy and pressure could turn Nasser from the Soviet orbit and help America leverage its influence over the Arab world, joined the USSR in forcing an end to the invasion. The crisis marked a definitive turning point. The age of the British Empire was over. The age of the American superpower had begun. From now on, American military and financial power would be the determining factor in the Muslim world, and indeed the world in general. But the Americans had learned well from their British predecessors. The same tactics of strategic and shifting alliances, double dealings, and covert operations that the British had used to maintain their influence for centuries would now be deployed by the Americans to leverage their own power. They applied these lessons in Iran, where they supported the Shah's brutal dictatorship even as they maintained a secret communication channel with exiled religious leader Ayatollah Khomeini. They applied these lessons in Indonesia, where the US at various times supported the Islamic factions in their rebellion against the Sukarno government itself, and, eventually, Suharto, who slaughtered over 500,000 people on his US-backed rise to power. They applied these lessons in the Sinai Peninsula, where, as declassified documents now show, US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger helped engineer the Yom Kippur War so that the Arabs would conclude the only way to peace was through us, and the Israelis would conclude that they had to depend on us to win, and couldn't win if we were too recalcitrant. And they applied these lessons in Saudi Arabia, where Treasury Secretary William Simon helped enshrine the US dollar's central role in global geopolitics and saved the US from the 1973 oil crisis by negotiating the petrodollar system, a covert deal with the House of Saud to purchase Saudi oil and sell them weapons and equipment in return for a Saudi pledge to finance American debt by investing their oil revenue in US treasuries. This era of American-led intrigue and double-dealing would culminate in one of the most important years for the Muslim world in the modern era, 1979. That was the year of the Iranian Revolution, when the American and British overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953 would come home to roost in the overthrow of the Western-backed Shah and the first major victory for the forces of political Islam in the creation of the Islamic Republic of Iran. That was the year of the seizure of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, when Islamic hardliners shocked the Muslim world by storming the holiest mosque in Islam and, during a dramatic 2-week standoff, calling for the overthrow of the House of Saud and the end of its attempts at westernization. That was the year Egyptian President Anwar Sadat signed a peace treaty with Israel, normalizing relations between the two countries and leading to Sadat's assassination by members of Egyptian Islamic Jihad just 2 years later. And that was also the year that developments in Afghanistan put in motion a chain of events that would lead to the creation of the group we now know as Al-Qaeda.
Soviet troops fought pitched battles in the streets of Kabul.
Some say that Soviet forces now are in complete control of all major towns and highways.
By all accounts, the Soviet takeover was meticulously planned and skillfully executed.
On Christmas Eve 1979, Soviet troops began an invasion of Afghanistan. Initially, this was portrayed to the American public as a spontaneous act of aggression, the opening salvo in a new campaign by the Russians to conquer the region and upset the world order.
50,000 heavily armed Soviet troops have crossed the border and are now dispersed throughout Afghanistan, attempting to conquer the fiercely independent Muslim people of that.
Actually, before that, I'm going to share ChatGPT conversations. So, because we're getting into we're getting into 9/11. Excuse me. How did America get so much money in World War II? How did America accumulate so much wealth during World War II? During World War II, the United States emerged as the world's dominant economic power due to a combination of strategic financial policies, industrial production, and war-related economic stimulation. Here's how. War production. The U.S. became the arsenal of democracy. Massive military production. The U.S. government mobilized its economy for war, transforming industries into war hubs. So again, war is a business. So General Dynamics, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, et cetera, it's been a business. Factories boomed. Companies like Ford, General Motors, and Boeing switched from producing consumer goods to manufacturing planes, tanks, ships, and weapons. You can add NASA in there as well. Full employment. The war effort ended the Great Depression by creating millions of jobs. Unemployment dropped from 14.6% in 1940 to 1.2% in 1944. Example, the U.S. produced 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and 2.5 million machine guns from 1941 to 45. War bonds and taxation. The government raised enormous funds. War bonds sold to the public. Okay, so like that's your taxpayers' money. The government raised $186 billion, over $3 trillion today, by selling bonds to Americans. So they were funding the war. High taxation on, obviously. High taxation on wealthy and corporations. Top income tax rates reached 94% on earnings over $200,000 to fund the war. Result, the U.S. funded its military without completely draining the economy. Yeah, you did, because you took a lot of money from your people. The gold standard and global financial shift. U.S. controlled 75% of the world's gold reserves by 1945. As European nations spent gold to pay for American war supplies, the U.S. became the wealthiest country in gold-backed assets. Lend-Release Act of 1941. The U.S. provided war materials to allies, Britain, USSR, China, but was often paid in gold or future economic agreements. Example, the UK shipped over $300 billion in gold to the U.S. to cover war debts. $300 billion in gold to cover war debts. Destruction of European economies. U.S. economy left untouched. Europe and Asia were in ruins. The war devastated European industrial and financial centers, making the U.S. the only major industry power intact. America became the lender of the world. The U.S. loaned billions through the Marshall Plan from 1947, creating financial dependency on American banks. Example, the UK alone owed the U.S. over $50 billion in war debt. The Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944. The U.S. dollar becomes the global reserve currency. Not a globe. Anyway, U.S. orchestrated a new global, in quotation marks, financial system. At Bretton Woods, the world agreed to peg currencies to the U.S. dollar instead of gold. The U.S. dollar became the dominant currency within the world, depending on dollars for trade. America controlled international finance. Result, the U.S. could print money and finance expansion without hyperinflation. The bottom line, World War II transformed America into the world's economic superpower. War production, high taxation, gold hoarding, and international financial dominance secured U.S. wealth. By 1945, America controlled 50% of the world's GDP. By taxing your own people to oblivion. Okay, so it asks me, want details on how this led to the U.S. petrodollar system and modern financial dominance? Yes, I do. How World War II led to the U.S. petrodollar system and modern financial dominance. After World War II, the United States solidified its control over global finance by turning the U.S. dollar into the world's reserve currency and later linking it to oil, creating the petrodollar system. This gave the U.S. unprecedented economic power that continues today. I know for some people that have been watching my channel for the last few years, this is already known to you. I'm sorry if I'm being redundant, but anyway. The Bretton Woods Agreement, 1944. The U.S. dollar becomes the international reserve currency. Why it happened? The world's major economies were destroyed. but the US held 75% of the world's gold reserves and had the only major industrial base left intact. What was decided? 44 allied nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and agreed to peg their currencies to the US dollar instead of gold, fix the value of the US dollar to gold at $35 per ounce. It's way higher now. What this meant, the US dollar became the foundation of international trade, and countries needed dollars, specifically US dollars, to conduct international business. Result, the US could print dollars freely, while other nations had to hold reserves of US dollars to conduct trade. That's changing now. So anyway, Nixon ends the gold standard in 1971. The US dollar becomes fiat. Problem. By the late 1960s, the US government spending skyrocketed due to the Vietnam War. Thanks, Lyndon B. friggin' Johnson and the Dulles brothers. And anyway, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. Yep. This guy, the criminal that I've talked about for years now. Let the JFK files be released, please. Everyone already knows what happened, for the most part. Anyway, foreign countries exchanging dollars for gold, especially France under Charles de Gaulle. Solution. In 1971, President Nixon, also corrupt, ended the gold standard, meaning the US dollar was no longer backed by gold. Impact. The dollar became a fiat currency backed only by the US government trust, and the world had to keep using dollars, but there was nothing physically backing them anymore. Result. The US could print unlimited dollars without the risk of running out of gold. The birth of the petrodollar system, 1973. After abandoning the gold standard, the US needed a new way to maintain the dollar's dominance. The answer? Oil. It's always about oil. Even what's going on in friggin' Palestine and Israel and Middle East, it's all about oil. And look at the Levant Basin and other places that just seem to coincide with areas that always get targeted. Saudi Arabia and OPEC agreements, 1974. The US struck a deal with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil producer at the time. Saudi Arabia would only sell oil in US dollars. In exchange, the US would provide military protection and weapons to the Saudi kingdom. Other OPEC nations, Iran, Iraq, Venezuela, etc., followed suit, meaning any country needing oil had to first buy US dollars, Canada as well. Result, the US dollar became the currency of oil transactions worldwide, creating artificial demand for dollars. How the petrodollar strengthens the US power. Countries must hold US dollars. Since every country needs oil, they must hold reserves of US dollars to buy it. The US can print money without inflation. Unlike other countries, the US can print more dollars without collapsing its economy because the world soaks up excess dollars for trade. US can fund wars and deficits easily. The Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air, and foreign nations are forced to buy US Treasury bonds, debt, to keep international markets stable. Example, the Iraq War 2003 cost $2.4 trillion taxpayers' money anyways, but the US didn't need to tax citizens more. It just printed money and issued debt that other countries had to buy. Taxes went up. That is statistically proven, obviously, and it's always around war times. US overthrows leaders who challenge the petrodollar. Whenever a country tries to ditch the US dollar for oil trade, the US government removes their leader or imposes sanctions. Iraq, 2000 to 2003. Saddam Hussein announced he would sell oil in euros instead of dollars. Result, the US invaded Iraq in 2003 under the pretext of weapons of mass destruction, removed Saddam, and reinstated oil sales in US dollars. There's obviously more to that as well, but Libya, 2011. Muammar Gaddafi planned to create a gold-backed African currency for oil trade. Result, NATO and the US backed rebels to overthrow Gaddafi. Libya was thrown into chaos, and its oil went back to the global market in dollars. Russia and China today, and Canada as well, with these friggin' wars that are starting. Both countries have been ditching the US dollars in oil trade, which is one reason for economic sanctions and geopolitical tensions. Where are we now? The future of the petrodollar. China, Russia, and BRICS nations are challenging the system. These countries are increasingly trading oil in their own currencies, reducing international reliance on the US dollar. Digital currencies, CBDCs, are on the rise, which I don't agree with. Anyways, the U.S. and other nations are exploring central bank digital currencies, which could replace the traditional dollar system with digital money under direct government control. I don't think that's a good idea either. I think it just should go back to the old system. But anyway, Saudi Arabia's shifting loyalties. Obviously, some kind of a hybrid of the old system. But this is more for conversations I would like to have with people in person and get money for it as a consultant. Anyway, Saudi Arabia's shifting loyalties. In 2023-24, Saudi Arabia allowed oil sales in Chinese yuan for the first time, signaling a potential end of the petrodollar era. I've talked about this before as well. Final thoughts why this matters. The petrodollar system has given the U.S. a unique economic advantage for 50 plus years, allowing limitless spending, military dominance, and international financial control. However, as countries move away from the U.S. dollar, we could see a collapse in demand for U.S. dollars, higher inflation and economic instability in America, potential military conflicts as the U.S. tries to enforce dollar dominance. And then it asked me, this is ChatGPT, do you want more details on how the decline of the petrodollar could impact international finance and geopolitics? Yes, I do. The decline of the petrodollar and its international impact. The petrodollar system has sustained U.S. economic dominance for 50 years over that, but it's now under serious threat as major world powers move away from the U.S. dollar. This shift could cripple the American economy, weaken Western dominance, and reshape international power structures. How the petrodollar has kept the U.S. powerful. Since the 1970s, the U.S. dollar has dominated international trade, especially in oil markets, allowing the U.S. to print unlimited money without hyperinflation, fund endless wars and massive government debt, control global finance through sanctions and economic pressure, force other countries to buy U.S. debt, treasury bonds, to sustain their economies, and why this works. Since nearly all nations needed U.S. dollars to buy oil, they were forced to hold dollar reserves, keeping the dollar artificially strong. And again, Canada included in that. The major threats to the petrodollar system, BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and I'm going to say Canada. If we start doing our own oil with our own currency, that would be really interesting. Actually, I'll share a video from Daniel Smith after this. Over 40 countries, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Argentina, are moving toward trading in local currencies instead of the US dollar. BRICS launched a payment system similar to SWIFT to bypass US dollar transactions. And why this matters? The less the world uses US dollars for trade, the weaker the dollar becomes, leading to inflation and financial instability in the US. Saudi Arabia no longer exclusive to the US dollar. Saudi Arabia was the backbone of the petrodollar deal, agreeing to sell oil only in US dollars in exchange for military protection. In 2023, Saudi Arabia allowed oil sales in Chinese yuan for the first time. In 2024, Saudi Arabia officially joins BRICS, signaling further de-dollarization of oil trade. Why this matters? If oil-producing nations ditch the dollar, international demand for US dollars collapses, leading to a US financial crisis. And this is why they're justifying murder, crimes against humanity, all of this stuff, and it's not even benefiting Americans. It is benefiting the elitist, entitled class that are exploiting you guys. Russia and China lead the charge against the dollar. Russia and China are trading oil, gas, and commodities in their own currencies, the ruble and yuan. China is pushing its petro yuan, or yuan, I don't know how you pronounce it, to replace the petrodollar. It's yuan I use. Anyway, India, Iran, Brazil, and other nations are also using local currencies for trade. Why this matters? If China replaces the US dollar in global trade, America's ability to print unlimited money ends, leading to higher inflation and an economic collapse. The rise of gold-backed currencies. BRICS is considering a gold-backed currency to compete with the US dollar. Great idea. Russia and China, well, I mean, not for America, but again, this is going to be an uncomfortable shift. What's happening is, especially with the ending of the wars, but again, this is not benefiting us, and again, we have to lead with ethics and morals and stop with the secular nationalism and this and this communist socialist agenda. And anyway, BRICS is considering a gold-backed currency. Russia and China have been stockpiling gold for years, preparing to launch a new currency based on real assets, gold, instead of fiat money, which is called paper dollars. And yeah, it'd be interesting. Like, I know Trump's talking about having people like record him going into the Federal Reserve to see how much gold there is. And Fort Knox, wherever it's. And I don't know. I think there'd be gold there. A return to gold-backed money would make U.S. fiat currency worthless in comparison, collapsing its value and international influence. What happens if the petrodollar collapses? If the U.S. loses the petrodollar system, the following will happen. Massive inflation in the U.S. And again, that's because of your friggin' people have been leading you guys into this mess for generations. So massive inflation in the U.S. Since the world no longer needs as many U.S. dollars, the dollar's value will drop, causing rising prices in America. Oil, food, and consumer goods could skyrocket in price as demand for the dollar shrinks. Higher interest rates and economic recession. The U.S. will struggle to sell treasury bonds, debt, forcing the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates. Housing, car loans, and business investments will become unaffordable, leading to massive economic slowdowns. U.S. loses control over international finance. Right now, U.S. sanctions work because the dollar dominates international trade. If countries ditch the dollar, the U.S. loses its ability to punish nations economically. Like Canada. More wars to protect the dollar. The U.S. has historically overthrown leaders who tried to sell oil in currencies other than the dollar. Iraq, Libya, etc. If Saudi Arabia, Iran, or China fully ditch the dollar, the U.S. may escalate military tensions to maintain global influence. The U.S. response: can it survive without the petrodollar? The U.S. government is aware of the looming collapse of the petrodollar system and is taking drastic steps to maintain control. Pushing central bank digital currencies, the U.S. is preparing a digital dollar to control transactions and replace the existing system. It will not work, and it's complete government control. And in this era, with so much corruption from within, like, we cannot trust the people that are working in these industries, ladies and gentlemen. This is massively like an overreach at this point. If we had ethical, moral people that were in the positions of power and influence, things would be great. Things would be great, but they're not. Expanding NATO and military presence. The U.S. is increasing military alliances to counter Russia and China's growing influence, including blowing up Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2. Oh my God, it's just ridiculous. Imposing sanctions on countries ditching the dollar. Nations like Iran, Venezuela, and Russia have been sanctioned for moving away from the dollar. However, these actions may not be enough to stop the inevitable shift away from the dollar. Final thought. The end of U.S. financial dominance. The U.S. dollar's international dominance is being challenged like never before. And if the petrodollar system collapses, America could face an economic crisis worse than the Great Depression. Key takeaways. The U.S. economy has been propped up by the petrodollar system for 50 plus years. The Clintons and people and the Bushes, again, people have been exploiting and monopolizing resources for their own benefits, not for you or me. Countries are actively moving away from the dollar, reducing its power. People don't want to support war and genocide and crimes against humanity and destroying the earth and cloud seeding, geoengineering, weather modification, EMF technologies that are being used to harm us. Like, I don't understand why this is. Anyway. Yeah, so China, Russia, and the BRICS are leading the push for a multi-currency world. And America could respond with war, economic crackdowns, or digital controls. And anyway, that's enough of that. I just wanted to show some of the reasons why this is all happening as well.
Country. If the Soviet
and they have control of the education system, they have control of pretty much everyone in cabinet, left or right, same bird. The judicial system, fully captured at this point at the higher level. CIA, FBI, CSIS, CSEC, CBSA, Global Affairs Canada. At the top, fully captured, fully psyopsed. Media, like I said, many times. Banking systems. It's the Bilderberg groups.
Soviets are encouraged in this invasion by eventual success, and if they maintain their dominance over Afghanistan, and then extend their control to adjacent countries, the stable, strategic, and peaceful balance of the entire world will be changed.
As historians with access to USSR document archives now know, the Soviet leadership was extremely reluctant to become entangled in Afghanistan. Well aware of the country's reputation as a graveyard of empires, Soviet politicians and military leaders knew that any attempt to bring Afghanistan under military and political control would be extremely difficult. Instead, the invasion was the end result of a series of events that threatened to plunge Afghanistan and the surrounding region into chaos. Starting in the wake of World War II, the urban, cosmopolitan political elite of the rural and agrarian nation of Afghanistan began a series of reforms and development projects that, they hoped, would bring their country into the modern era. Seeking assistance in this task, these leaders turned to the USSR, who, in addition to providing $100 million in low-interest credit to finance the projects, also welcomed members of the country's political and military elite for training at Soviet institutions. In turn, these young Afghan elites brought communism back to their country. The Afghan communists supported a bloodless coup in Kabul in 1973, overthrowing the king and instituting a one-party state whose government included representation by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, a pro-Soviet Marxist-Leninist party that boasted ties to the Afghan National Army. But the PDPA, frustrated by a perceived lack of progress toward communist goals on the part of this new government, precipitated another coup in 1978. This new communist government, led by Nur Muhammad Turaki, presided over a period of dramatic reform. Land reform sought to limit how much land a family could own. Social reforms abolished Sharia law, began education of women, and sought to end forced marriages and other traditional practices. And political dissidents were rounded up and resistant villagers massacred. Violently opposed both by the Islamic fundamentalists and conservatives in the country, as well as opposing factions within his own party, Turaki was overthrown in September of 1979 and killed the following month. Taraki's successor and one-time protege, Hafizullah Amin, led an even shorter and more turbulent government. Taking over the presidency in September, Amin, who, the Russians feared, was seeking to improve Afghanistan's relations with the United States, was deposed when Soviet forces entered the country and assassinated him on December 27, 1979. The official history, written by the CIA, echoed by the US State Department, and propounded in Hollywood productions, maintains that the US response to the events in Afghanistan, a response that would go on to include billions of dollars in arms, funds, and training for the Islamic resistance to the Soviet forces, began after the Soviet invasion in 1979.
The defeat and breakup of the Soviet Empire, culminating in the crumbling of the Berlin Wall, is one of the great events of world history.
CIA puppet.
There were many heroes in this battle, but to Charlie Wilson must go this special recognition. Just 13 years ago, the Soviet Army appeared to be invincible. But Charlie, undeterred, engineered a lethal body blow that weakened the communist empire. Without Charlie, history would be hugely and sadly different. And so, for the first time, a civilian is being given our highest recognition, that of honored colleague. Ladies and gentlemen of the clandestine services, Congressman Charles Wilson.
But this, too, is a lie. In reality, the covert operation to aid the Mujahideen freedom fighters did not begin after the Soviets invaded, and it was not the work of Charlie Wilson. As former CIA Director Robert Gates revealed in his 1996 autobiography, assistance to the Afghan Mujahideen did not start after the Soviet invasion, but 6 months before, in July 1979, with President Jimmy Carter signing off on a covert operation to assist and fund the resistance forces in Afghanistan. This was done in the full knowledge that these forces might antagonize and draw the Soviets into the country, which is precisely what a certain faction of the Carter White House, known as the Bleeders for their propensity to bleed the Soviet Union through an engaged guerrilla conflict like the US had experienced in Vietnam, wanted to achieve. This was confirmed 2 years later by Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, in a 1998 interview. According to the official version of history, CIA aid to the Mujahideen began during 1980, that is to say, after the Soviet Army invaded Afghanistan on December 24, 1979. But the reality, closely guarded until now, is completely otherwise. Indeed, it was July 3, 1979 that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. And that very day, I wrote a note to the president in which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention. The program that Carter signed off on, dubbed Operation Cyclone and billed as the largest covert operation in history, continued and expanded throughout the 1980s, leading to the rise of the Taliban and the encouragement of what Brzezinski called in that same interview, some agitated Muslims.
U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski flew to Pakistan to set about rallying resistance. He wanted to arm the Mujahideen without revealing America's role. On the Afghan border near the Khyber Pass, he urged the soldiers of God to redouble their efforts.
We know of their deep belief in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed. That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
The purpose of coordinating with the Pakistanis would be to make the Soviets bleed for as much and as long as is possible.
Yep.
News of the
and I've shared Yuri Bezmenov for years, but he was a former KGB, and he talks about his involvement in being like a spy doing covert operations in the Middle East and or like Western Asia, whatever you want to call it, and he was involved in these.
Began to spread throughout the
creating the, I guess we would call it division.
Arab world, and soon the stories of the brave Mujahideen fighting the communist infidels became a rallying cry for jihad. The Afghan resistance had made Peshawar, just over the border in Pakistan, their headquarters, and it was there that visitors from around the Muslim world heard firsthand the tales from the battles against the Soviets and saw for themselves the squalor of the refugees who had been forced from their homes by the Russian invaders. One such visitor was Abdullah Azam, a passionate young Palestinian whose militant activism had cost him his job as a lecturer at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, and had prompted him to take a position in Islamabad so he could be closer to the Afghan jihad. But this was still not close enough, and he resigned his position to dedicate himself full-time to the Afghan cause. He spent time in the refugee camps and Mujahideen base at Peshawar, issued a fatwa arguing that Muslims had a duty to wage jihad in Afghanistan, and made frequent trips to Jeddah, where he recruited young Muslims for the cause. While in Jeddah, he stayed at the guest flat of a rich young Saudi named Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was the 17th of 54 children of Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, an itinerant laborer from Yemen who had worked his way up in the Saudi construction business to become one of the wealthiest non-royals in the Saudi kingdom. Mohammed bin Laden's business, today known as the Bin Laden Group Global Holding Company and comprising a sprawling, multi-billion-dollar multinational conglomerate involved in some of the largest construction projects in the world, started from humble beginnings. After arriving in Jeddah from his native Yemen in 1930, Mohammed bin Laden took a job as a dock worker, then as a bricklayer for Aramco during the country's first oil boom. When Aramco sought to subcontract some of the construction work it had undertaken for the Saudi government, bin Laden used the opportunity to grow his own construction firm. His exacting building standards, combined with his energy, his honesty, and his willingness to work shoulder to shoulder with his men, earned Mohammed bin Laden a reputation as a craftsman and a teacher, and brought him to the attention of King Ibn Saud's finance minister. The aging King Saud, by now largely confined to a wheelchair, gave bin Laden the chance to renovate his palace in Jeddah so that his car could be driven by ramp directly to his second-floor bedroom. Impressed with bin Laden's work, and bin Laden's gesture of personally driving the king's car up the newly installed ramp to make sure it would hold the weight, the king awarded him with a number of increasingly important projects and even appointed him as an honorary minister of public works. Bin Laden's business, later rebranded as the Saudi Bin Laden Group, would go on to construct most of the kingdom's roads, renovate the Prophet's mosque at Medina, and even renovate the Grand Mosque in Mecca itself. Although Mohammed bin Laden's fortune was split between dozens of heirs, and although Osama's father divorced his mother shortly after he was born, the younger bin Laden was still born into a life of luxury that few in the kingdom outside the royal family would ever know. Osama bin Laden's share of the family fortune has been estimated at $30 million, and it was expected that he would, like many of his brothers, take up the family business. He studied economics and business administration at King Abdulaziz University, where he met and was influenced by Abdullah Azzam, who was by then already known for his credo, jihad and the rifle alone, no negotiations, no conferences, and no dialogues. Accounts of when and how Osama bin Laden first ended up in Afghanistan differ. According to Osama himself, speaking to Robert Fisk in his first interview for the Western press in 1993, "When the invasion of Afghanistan started, I was enraged and went there at once. I arrived within days before the end of 1979. Others contend that Osama had never heard of Afghanistan before the Soviet invasion, and that he didn't set foot in the country itself until 1984. Whatever the case, by the mid-1980s, bin Laden was well known as one of the key fundraisers for the Afghan cause in the Arab world, using his family connections to gather donations from rich Saudis and delivering them to Pakistan to assist the fighters in the field. In 1984, Osama and Azzam co-founded Maktab al-Khidmat, or the Office of Services, which the US government would later identify as the precursor organization to al-Qaeda. The group aimed to recruit the foreign fighters that were taking up Azzam's call to join the jihad in Afghanistan, with bin Laden providing money through his fundraising connections and with direct contributions. Initially little more than a guest house in Peshawar where foreign recruits for the Afghan war could stop on their way to the front, the operation quickly expanded as money poured in and more fighters began to arrive. Soon it caught the attention of other figures in the Afghan war, including Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, a brutal Afghan warlord supported by the US to the tune of $600 million who was known for killing more Afghans than Soviets, and Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of Egyptian Islamic Jihad, who would go on to become Osama bin Laden's right-hand man. The New Yorker has called Zawahiri the man behind bin Laden. Saeed Salim Shahzad, a Pakistani journalist with access to senior al-Qaeda commanders, has argued it was Zawahiri, not the figurehead bin Laden, who formulated the organization's ideological line and devised operational plans. Born in a suburb of Cairo in 1951 to a distinguished middle-class family, Zawahiri went on to study medicine at Cairo University, eventually earning a master's degree in surgery and serving 3 years as a surgeon in the Egyptian army before establishing his own clinic. He wore Western dress, avoided the radical Islamist activism sweeping campus in his university days, and, according to one Westerner who met him in the mid-1970s, didn't talk or act like a traditional Muslim. But, we are asked to believe, this was all a front. In fact, according to the authors of the officially sanctioned history of al-Qaeda, Zawahiri was a lifelong radical who had joined the Muslim Brotherhood in 1965 at the tender young age of 14, and was set on his path toward violent jihad the next year, after the execution of the Brotherhood's then leader, Sayyid Qutb. Qutb was famous for his role in inspiring a generation of radical Muslims, including Azzam, Osama, and Zawahiri, to take up violent jihad against the West and the forces of modernity in the creation of a new caliphate. Less remembered is Qutb's assertion that, during the 1960s, when Saudi King Faisal was openly conspiring with CIA and Aramco to stir up anti-socialist Muslim groups and undermine pan-Arabism and Arab nationalism, America made Islam. The then 15-year-old Zawahiri, we are told, responded to Qutb's execution by helping to form an underground militant cell dedicated to replacing the secular Egyptian government with an Islamic one. By the late 1970s, a number of these cells had merged into a larger militant organization, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which, incensed by President Anwar Sadat's signing of a peace treaty with Israel, assassinated him during a military parade on October 6, 1981. Zawahiri was one of over 300 militants rounded up in the wake of the assassination and, having the best command of English among the defendants, became their spokesman for the international press.
To the whole world, this is our word by Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. Now, we want to speak to the whole world. Who are we? Who are we? Why did they bring us here? And what we want to say. About the first question, We are Muslims. We are Muslims who believed in their religion in its broad meaning as both an ideology and practice. We believed in our religion both as an ideology and practice, and hence we tried our best to establish this Islamic State and Islamic society.
Before being arrested, Zawahiri had already spent time in Peshawar, seeing firsthand the squalor of the refugee camps, and even crossing the border into Afghanistan to witness the fighting itself. After his release from prison in Egypt in 1984, Zawahiri made his way to Jeddah, and then back to Peshawar. Thus, by the mid-1980s, all of the main characters that were associated with the rise of modern Islamic terror and the founding of al-Qaeda, Azzam, Osama, Zawahiri, and their early associates, were now directly involved in the war in Afghanistan. They were not a single cohesive group. Azzam and Zawahiri were rivals for Osama's funds and attention, with Zawahiri even spreading rumors among the Mujahideen that Azzam worked for the Americans. But together, they formed the backbone of what would come to be called the Afghan Arabs, an inaccurate term for all of the foreign jihadis who came to fight in Afghanistan, both Arab, including Saudis recruited by Osama and Egyptian members of Zawahiri's Islamic Jihad group, and non-Arab, Turks, Malays, and others from across the Muslim world. The Afghan Arabs were not the main fighting force in Afghanistan. In fact, some argue they were almost totally irrelevant to the fight. Making up only a small percentage of the total Mujahideen, they often got into quarrels with the Afghan fighters and were responsible for almost no significant victories in the struggle against the Soviets. But the story of these holy warriors who had answered the call of jihad spread throughout the Muslim world, helped in no small part by their own propensity for self-promotion. Azzam launched Al-Jihad magazine to help publicize the Afghan Arabs' exploits and, with Osama's funding behind him, was able to make it an international concern. Distributed in America by the Islamic Center in Tucson, Arizona, the magazine sold thousands of copies per month in the US alone. But for some time there has been debate about the nature of the US role in fostering and funding the Afghan Arabs. While historians, scholars, and journalists agree that CIA funding for the Afghan Jihad, estimated to be well over $3 billion, did find its way to the Arab fighters, it has long been debated whether there was any direct contact between American intelligence and Osama bin Laden. In the officially sanctioned history of the Afghan-Soviet War, the Americans were aiding the people of Afghanistan, brave freedom fighters who were engaged in a heroic struggle against the evil Soviet Empire.
The fact that freedom is the strongest force in the world is daily demonstrated by the people of Afghan. Accordingly, I am dedicating on behalf of the American people the March 22nd launch of the Columbia to the people of Afghanistan. The support that the United States has been providing the resistance will be strengthened rather than diminished so that it can continue to fight effectively for freedom. A just struggle against foreign tyranny can count upon worldwide support, both political and material. On behalf of the American people, I salute Chairman Khalis, his delegation, and the people of Afghanistan themselves. You are a nation of heroes. God bless you.
Hard to believe, John. What's that, sir? Well, I hate to admit it, but the truth is I think we're getting soft. Maybe just a little, sir. Just a little.
This is the story propounded by the final report of the 9/11 Commission, which holds that the covert aid supplied for the operation by the United States went to Pakistan, who then distributed the funds and supplies directly to the Afghan fighters, not the Afghan Arabs. Saudi Arabia and the United States supplied billions of dollars worth of secret assistance to rebel groups in Afghanistan fighting the Soviet occupation, the 9/11 Commission explained in the section of its report dedicated to the rise of bin Laden and al-Qaeda. This assistance was funneled through Pakistan. The Pakistani Military Intelligence Service, Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, or ISID, helped train the rebels and distribute the arms. But bin Laden and his comrades had their own sources of support and training, and they received little or no assistance from the United States. Here, the 9/11 Commission is in agreement with Zawahiri himself, who insisted in his 2001 book, Knights Under the Prophet's Banner, that the United States did not give one penny in aid to the Mujahideen. After all, he adds, if the Arab Afghans are the mercenaries of the United States who have now rebelled against it, why is the United States unable to buy them back now? Zawahiri's rhetorical question has not always been answered in the way he intended it. In fact, numerous sources over the years have pointed to just such direct contact between the US and the Afghan Arabs, and even between the CIA and Osama bin Laden himself. There was Ted Gunderson, for example, a 27-year veteran of the FBI who claimed to have met bin Laden at the Hilton Hotel in Sherman Oaks, California in 1986. Osama, Gunderson says, was introduced under the name Tim Osman and was in the midst of a US tour with a State Department handler looking to procure weapons and support for the Afghan jihad. The only document that ever emerged to back this story up, however, was a crude, self-typed, single-page memo of unknown origin that only serves to throw an already dubious story into even further doubt. Or there was journalist Joseph Trento's claim in his 2006 book, Prelude to Terror, The Rogue CIA and the Legacy of America's Private Intelligence Network, that CIA money was actually funneled to MAK, since it was recruiting young Muslim men to come join the jihad in Afghanistan. That claim, however, comes from a former CIA officer who couldn't be identified because, at the time of the writing of this book, he was back in Afghanistan as a private contractor. Or there was Simon Reeve, who wrote The New Jackals, the first book on al-Qaeda in 1998. In it, he states that US agents armed bin Laden's men by letting him pay rock-bottom prices for basic weapons. This claim, too, sources to an anonymous former CIA official. In 2000, The Guardian reported on bin Laden, the question facing the next US president, stating flatly, in 1986, the CIA even helped bin Laden build an underground camp at Khost, where he was to train recruits from across the Islamic world in the business of guerrilla warfare. No source is provided for the claim, however. In 2003, MSNBC senior correspondent Michael Moran wrote that bin Laden, along with a small group of Islamic militants from Egypt, Pakistan, Lebanon, Syria, and Palestinian refugee camps all over the Middle East, became the reliable partners of the CIA in its war against Moscow. However, he conceded that it should be pointed out that the evidence of bin Laden's connection to these activities is mostly classified. Supporters of the official story, however, make a valid point. Of all the things that the multimillionaire heir to the bin Laden family fortune needed on his rise to international infamy, money was not one of them. No, what bin Laden needed for his burgeoning terror group to thrive was not more money. It was protection. As he turned from anti-Soviet warrior to international terror mastermind, bin Laden needed officials to look the other way as his people moved across borders. He needed routine security procedures to be abandoned at key moments. He needed intelligence agencies to disconnect the dots and fail to act on information at their disposal. When members of his organization got caught, he needed strings to be pulled so his associates could continue their operation. And, as we shall see, this is precisely the type of protection that Osama bin Laden and his associates were to receive time and again in the coming decades. Regardless of direct Western intelligence involvement in the arming, funding, or training of Maktab al-Khidmat, the question soon became a moot point. As the Afghan war was drawing to its inevitable conclusion, and the Soviets prepared to march back to Moscow, Osama bin Laden was already planning a new group to consolidate his international network of mujahideen and to take the jihad global. According to documents obtained from a March 2002 raid of the Sarajevo offices of Benevolence International Foundation, a not-for-profit humanitarian relief organization that was declared a financier of terrorism in the wake of 9/11, the original idea for the founding of al-Qaeda was discussed in a meeting on August 11, 1988. In attendance at the meeting, Osama bin Laden, Mohammed Atef, an Egyptian engineer and member of Zawahiri's Egyptian Islamic Jihad, who would go on to become al-Qaeda's military commander, Jamal al-Fadl, a Sudanese militant recruited for the Afghan war from the AK's U.S. headquarters in Brooklyn, and a dozen others. There are conflicting stories about the origin of the name al-Qaeda, which means the base in Arabic. Bin Laden claims that al-Qaeda was simply the name used for the Mujahideen training camps, and the name stayed. Others attribute it to Abdullah Azzam, who published a brief article in Al Jihad magazine in April 1988 entitled Al-Qaeda al-Suba, or The Solid Base, in which he wrote, "For every invention, there must be a vanguard to carry it forward, and, while forcing its way into society, endure enormous expenses and costly sacrifices. There is no ideology, neither earthly nor heavenly, that does not require such a vanguard that gives everything it possesses in order to achieve victory for this ideology. It carries the flag all along the sheer endless and difficult path until it reaches its destination in the reality of life, since Allah has destined that it should make it and manifest itself. This vanguard constitutes the solid base, Al-Qaeda al-Suba, for the expected society. In 2005, former British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook claimed that Al-Qaeda was literally the database. That is, the computer file of the thousands of mujahideen who were recruited and trained with help from the CIA to defeat the Russians. He did not, however, provide proof for this claim, evidence of the existence of such a database itself, or an explanation of how he knew this information. The founding document itself mentions Al-Qaeda al-Askariya, the military base, explaining that the mentioned Al-Qaeda is basically an organized Islamic faction. Its goal will be to lift the word of God, to make his religion victorious. It lists the requirements to enter Al-Qaeda: members of the open duration, listening and obedient, good manners, referred from a trusted side, obeying statutes and instructions of Al-Qaeda. These are from the rules of the work. It gives the pledge for new members. The pledge of God and his covenant is upon me, to listen and obey the superiors who are doing this work in energy, early rising, difficulty, and easiness, and for his superiority upon us, so that the word of God will be the highest, and his religion victorious. And it ends by noting that there were 30 brothers in Al-Qaeda, meeting the requirements, and thank God. The meeting was noted by no one. In the larger scheme of things, it meant nothing. A ragtag band of 30 fighters, even if that ragtag band was led and financed by a Saudi millionaire, could accomplish very little on their own. And in the wake of the seismic forces taking place in Afghanistan at the time, it did not even register as a blip on the radar of anyone in the region.
Nope.
But the assistance and protection that would help steward this group of jihadi miscreants into a brand name for international terror was already in effect. The early glimmers of this protection could be seen in Maktab al-Khidmat's efforts to recruit and train mujahideen for the Afghan jihad in the US. Starting in Tucson, Arizona, MAK would go on to open 30 branches in cities across the US, including their most important location, the Al-Qifa Refugee Center based out of Brooklyn's Farouk Mosque. The CIA's role in aiding MAK and Al-Qifa in their recruitment efforts has been an acknowledged fact for decades. In 2001, Newsweek called the center a dreary inner-city building that doubled as a recruiting post for the CIA seeking to steer fresh troops to the Mujahideen. In 1995, New York Magazine explained, the highlight for the center's regulars were the inspirational jihad lecture series featuring CIA-sponsored speakers. One week on Atlantic Avenue, it might be a CIA-trained Afghan rebel traveling on a CIA-issued visa. The next, it might be a clean-cut Arabic-speaking Green Beret who would lecture about the importance of being part of the Mujahideen. J. Michael Springman, a visa officer at the U.S. consulate in Jeddah from 1987 to 1989, testified how his decisions to deny visas to enter the United States to clearly unqualified applicants were routinely overridden by CIA officers at the consulate as part of their effort to help Osama bin Laden's Mujahideen in Afghanistan.
I was being pressured by the Consul General, J. Philip Freres, by a consular officer, I'm sorry, not a consular officer, a commercial officer, and various other people throughout the consulate. We need a visa for this guy. It wasn't a visa for my friend. It wasn't a visa for a prospective business contact. It was for somebody like the two Pakistanis who were going to a trade show in the United States. They couldn't name the trade show. They couldn't name the city in which it was being held. But a CIA case officer, concealed in the commercial section, demanded a visa for these people within the hour of my refusing them. And I said, no, they can't tell me where they're going. They can't tell me why they're going. The law is very clear. These are intending immigrants unless and until they can prove otherwise. And they haven't done it. Do you have some information that was not available to me when they applied? He said, no. I said, they're not going. He went to Justice Stevens, the chief of the consular section, and got a visa for these guys. And it wasn't until
And he is a hero. Like, this is someone doing his job, right? So if there were more people like him doing their jobs like you're supposed to do and refusing to give visas because of all these details that he just listed, like, we would be so much better off. But instead, you'll hear what happens to people like this and me and Helen and countless others when we whistleblow, just literally just saying like, no, this isn't right. I'm not doing this. And then someone else does it within your same department. And then you're like, no, this is not right. Like, we need to like address this. Then it's only at that point where you say it out loud, right? But to higher levels, supervisors. Yeah. And they just shut it down.
Until I was out of the Foreign Service, when my appointment had been terminated for unspecified reasons, that I learned from three good sources. Joe Trento, the journalist, a fellow attached to a university in Washington, D.C., and a guy with expert knowledge on the Middle East who had worked for a government agency. They said, it's very simple. The CIA and its asset Osama bin Laden were recruiting terrorists for the Afghan war. They were sending them to the United States for training, for rewards, for whatever purpose, and then sending them.
So I served as an infantry officer from 2001 to 2016. And when I woke up, that was like another big reason why I had a friggin' breakdown and ended up medically releasing. But I incorporated, and I was working immediately afterwards with like the highest levels of government because of my expertise and my skill sets. And until COVID, I was very busy. I don't even know where I was going with this.
Went to Afghanistan and...
Oh yeah, obviously. But I still know people, that don't know what happened and realize that even like all the people that we lost, they were trained by us and Americans, the people that we were fighting against, and funded by us and Americans. And
most likely
in NATO.
The problems they had with the liquor at the consulate, large amounts of it disappearing, it being sold at very high markups, and so forth, was being used to fund this.
In a 1994 debriefing of his experience at Jeddah, Springman cited Sheikh Abdel Rahman as one of the CIA operatives with terrorist ties who were being aided by this program. Omar Abdel Rahman, better known as the Blind Sheikh, was born in Egypt in 1938 and lost his eyesight at just 10 months old. Studying a Braille version of the Quran, Rahman was sent to an Islamic boarding school and, inspired by the writings of Sayyid Qutb, earned a doctorate in Quranic interpretation from Al-Azhar University in Cairo. He made a name for himself among Islamic fundamentalists for his forceful denunciations of the secular government of Nasser, who imprisoned Rahman without charges for several months. It was Rahman who issued the fatwa that was used to justify the assassination of Sadat, and it was in prison, on trial for his part in the assassination, that Rahman met Zawahiri. After his release from prison, the Blind Sheikh made his way to join the jihad in Afghanistan, where, as even mainstream sources note, he is said to have established links with the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA, it was later reported, had paid for Rahman to travel to Peshawar and preach to the Afghans about the necessity of unity to overthrow the Kabul regime. These CIA links served the Blind Sheikh well. As one of the most notorious Islamic radicals in the Middle East, the Blind Sheikh was on a U.S. State Department terrorist watch list that should have barred him entry to America. Nevertheless, in May 1990, he obtained a tourist visa to enter the United States from a consul in the U.S. Embassy in Khartoum. When the visa was first reported to the public in December of that year, a spokesperson for the State Department insisted that the consul had made a mistake, explaining that they didn't follow the procedures and failed to check Rahman's name against the State Department watch list. It wasn't until July of 1993, 5 months after the bombing of the World Trade Center directed by Rahman and aided by an FBI informant, that the truth was revealed. Central Intelligence Agency officers reviewed all 7 applications made by Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman to enter the United States between 1986 and 1990, and only once turned him down because of his connections to terrorism, reported the New York Times, adding that, while the practice is somewhat sensitive and not widely known, it is not unusual for a low-level CIA officer to be assigned a post as a consular official, as they had been in each of the 7 cases. It was later reported that the visas had been a reward for Rahman's services to the CIA in Afghanistan. Incredibly, this was not the end of the string of lucky breaks that allowed Rahman, the leader of the first Islamic terror cell to operate on US soil, to continue his operations unmolested. In November of 1990, his CIA-approved tourist visa was revoked, but because of a procedural error, immigration officials were not aware that he was in the country and had to begin an investigation before he could be deported. Despite all of this, Rahman was still able to obtain a green card for permanent residence in the United States in April of 1991. After leaving the country and returning in August of that year, immigration officials identified that he was on a watch list and began proceedings to rescind his residency status, but they allowed him to re-enter the United States anyway. His green card was revoked in March of 1992, but he was still allowed to remain in the country while he applied for political asylum and plotted the World Trade Center bombing out of the MAK-founded, CIA-connected Al-Qaeda stronghold in Brooklyn, the Al-Qifa Refugee Center. But as remarkable as the Blind Sheikh story is, it is not unique. Rahman was not the only person associated with Al-Qaeda's Al-Qifa Center who proved able to freely enter the US despite being on a watch list. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the future leader of Al-Qaeda, made at least 3 visits to the United States. Despite having been imprisoned in Egypt for 3 years after the assassination of Sadat, and despite his known role as the leader of Egyptian Islamic Jihad, Zawahiri was able to enter the US and, using an alias and posing as a representative of the Kuwaiti Red Crescent Society, engage in fundraising for his terror group. His trip was made possible by one of his most important operatives, Ali Mohammed, who had arranged the trip and provided him with the fake passport he used to enter the country. It is in the story of Ali Mohammed, dubbed Al-Qaeda's triple agent, that the incredible ties between US intelligence and Al-Qaeda are revealed. Indeed, the tale of Mohammed's unlikely career, described as the most tantalizing and complex story in the history of Al-Qaeda's war against America, is so utterly unbelievable that a Hollywood scriptwriter would reject it for being too implausible.
Yep.
The son of a career soldier in the Egyptian army, Mohammed attended the Cairo Military Academy and obtained 2 bachelor's degrees and a master's degree in psychology from the University of Alexandria. Mohammed followed in his father's footsteps, joining the Egyptian army and quickly rising to the rank of major. An intelligence officer in the Egyptian Special Forces, Mohammed was a member of the same unit that carried out the assassination of Sadat in 1981. But he was not in Egypt when it happened. He was training with the US Green Berets at Fort Bragg on a foreign officer exchange program. The FBI would later allege that it was during this training course that Mohammed was first approached by the CIA, who sought to recruit him as a foreign asset. That same year, Mohammed joined Zawahiri's Egyptian Islamic Jihad and raised the suspicions of the Egyptian army, not just for his ties to the Sadat assassination unit, but his conspicuous acts of Islamic fundamentalism, including taking time for the 5 daily prayers and loudly proclaiming his Islamic beliefs to anyone who would listen. Discharged from the Egyptian army in 1984, Mohammed, at the behest of Zawahiri, landed a job as a counterterrorism security advisor for Egypt Air. Impressed by Mohammed's abilities, Zawahiri tasked him with a seemingly impossible challenge: infiltrate an intelligence service of the US government. Remarkably, according to the official history of Al-Qaeda propounded by the very intelligence services Mohammed was tasked with infiltrating, that was exactly what he did. According to that official story, in 1984, Mohammed turned up at the CIA station in Cairo, offering his services. The CIA took him up on the offer, sending him to Hamburg, Germany to infiltrate a Hezbollah-linked mosque there. Upon arriving in Hamburg, Mohammed immediately announced that he had been sent by the CIA. The agency, learning of the betrayal, officially cut their ties with him, putting Mohammed on a State Department watch list that should have prevented him from entering the US. But, as government sources later told the Boston Globe, he was able to enter the country in 1985 anyway with the help of clandestine CIA sponsorship. According to the report, Mohammed benefited from a little-known visa waiver program that allows the CIA and other security agencies to bring valuable agents into the country, bypassing the usual immigration formalities. What happened next defies all credulity. On his flight from Athens to New York, Mohammed sat next to Linda Lee Sanchez, a single medical technician from Santa Clara, California, 10 years his senior. After spending the flight in conversation, the two agreed to meet again, and 6 weeks later they were married at the Chapel of the Bells in Reno, Nevada. Now applying for U.S. citizenship, Mohammed enlisted in the U.S. Army in August 1986, completing basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and receiving an Army Achievement Medal for his exemplary performance. Completing jump school and qualifying as an expert marksman on the M16, Mohammed quickly reached the rank of E4 and was then inexplicably posted to the Special Operations Command at Fort Bragg, where he had earlier trained as a foreign exchange officer. Working as a supply sergeant for a Green Beret unit, he was soon lecturing on the Middle East to students at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center, the training center for U.S. Special Forces.
Islam cannot survive in area without political domination. Islam itself as a religion cannot. So if I live in one area, we have to establish an Islamic state, because Islam without political domination cannot survive.
Even his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Anderson, was stunned by the incredibly unlikely rise through the ranks of this watch-listed Muslim radical. I think you or I would have a better chance of winning the Powerball lottery than an Egyptian major in the unit that assassinated Sadat would have of getting a visa, getting to California, getting into the army, and getting assigned to a special forces unit, Anderson later told the San Francisco Chronicle. That just doesn't happen.
Well, it did.
But it did. And the unbelievable story of Ali Mohammed did not stop there. In fact, it was only just beginning. In 1987, Mustafa Shalabi, the emir of the al-Qaeda-linked Al-Kifah Refugee Center in Brooklyn, transmitted a request from the Mujahideen in Afghanistan for Ali Mohammed to come and train rebel troops in the camps there. Mohammed requested a 30-day leave from the army and made his preparations to travel to Paris, and from there on to Afghanistan using forged documents provided to him by Mujahideen agents. Mohammed made no attempt to hide his plan, and Lieutenant Colonel Steve Neely, the JFK Special Warfare Center instructor who hired Mohammed as a lecturer, was so upset at the idea. A U.S. soldier heading to a war zone to engage in training and, inevitably, combat without the permission of the army, that he sent a report up the chain of command informing his superior officers about Mohammed's plan. But he never heard back. Ali Mohammed went to Afghanistan, where he not only provided training to the Mujahideen, but, according to his own story, even fought and killed 2 Soviet Special Forces officers. When he returned to his duties at Fort Bragg after his 30-day leave, he even presented one of his mementos, a belt from one of the Soviet soldiers he had killed, to his commanding officer.
A month after he left for Afghanistan, Ali Mohammed returns here, 11 kilograms lighter and brandishing a war trophy.
And he came back and gave us a debriefing with maps, and even brought back this Russian Special Forces belt. He said that he'd killed the Russian Special Forces soldier.
Colonel Anderson says he sent 2 separate reports to his superiors criticizing Ali Mohammed for his Afghan adventure. But he received no response, and Anderson says he did not have enough evidence to bring charges against Mohammed.
So outrageous was Mohammed's behavior that his commanding officer came to believe that he was being sponsored by a U.S. intelligence agency. I assumed the CIA, he told the San Francisco Chronicle. Anderson was not alone in this belief. Back in California, Mohammed's friends also assumed his CIA ties. Everyone in the community knew he was working as a liaison between the CIA and the Afghan cause. Ali Zaki, a San Jose obstetrician who was close to Mohammed, told the Washington Post. CIA sponsorship would explain Mohammed's incredible ability to break army regulations at will with complete impunity. While serving in the U.S. Armed Forces, Mohammed spent his weekends traveling from Fort Bragg to Brooklyn, where he lectured at the Al-Kifah Refugee Center and began providing military training and stolen U.S. Special Forces documents to a cell of Islamic militants based there. Despite all of this, Mohammed received an honorable discharge from active duty in November 1989. Among the commendations he received, one for patriotism, valor, fidelity, and professional excellence.
Wow.
He remained a member of the U.S. Army Reserve as he returned to his wife in California and began the next leg of his career. As we shall see, This increasingly implausible story involved Mohammed becoming an FBI informant while simultaneously training and steering the terror cells that would be linked to the World Trade Center bombing, the US Embassy bombings, and the other spectacular attacks in the 1990s that would make al-Qaeda synonymous with international terrorism, evading the justice system for years, and then disappearing off the face of the planet. By the time Mohammed left active duty at the end of 1989, the world order was beginning to shift. The Soviets had retreated from Afghanistan, and within 2 short years, the Soviet Union itself had ceased to exist. The Cold War was over, and the public was promised a new world of peace and tranquility.
We stand tonight before a new world of hope and possibilities for our children, a world we could not have contemplated a few years ago. The challenge for us now is to engage these new states in sustaining the peace and building a more prosperous future.
But this promised new world of hope never arrived. Instead, the world was about to be thrust into a new age of terror. And the public face of that terror, a young Saudi millionaire who was still being touted as an anti-Soviet warrior, had just cobbled together his band of Islamic militants, his al-Qaeda base, in the training camps of Afghanistan. And, as we will see, as the world plunged into this new era of violence, the planners of the American empire, like the planners of the British Empire before them, were more than willing to aid, protect, and use these radical Muslims to attain their own ends.
Groups affiliated with Osama bin Laden.
To target the United States.
There are 4 people confirmed
We've
dead.
called this the terror at the tower.
Next time on the Corbett Report.
Flowing out their ass, and they had massive supplies of cocaine.
You know that the bombs start to be built. By who? By your confidential informant.
These guys had money flowing out their ass, and they had massive supplies of cocaine.
There was a high-level decision in the CIA ordering people not to share that information.
We just saw on live television as a second plane flew into the second tower of the World Trade Center.
The world will not be the same from today on.
False Flags, The Secret History of Al-Qaeda. Part 2, 9/11. Coming soon to CorbettReport.com. Previously on the Corbett Report. We all know the story of bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, the story that was repeated ad nauseum in the days, weeks, and months after the catastrophic, catalyzing events of 9/11. But this is a lie.
Some say that Soviet forces now are in complete control of all major towns and highways.
We have to establish an Islamic State because Islam without political domination cannot survive.
The world was about to be thrust into a new age of terror. And the public face of that terror, a young Saudi millionaire who was still being touted as an anti-Soviet warrior, had just cobbled together his band of Islamic militants, his al-Qaeda base, in the training camps of Afghanistan.
Groups affiliated with Osama bin Laden.
To target the United States. Links to Al-Qaeda.
Alexandria, Egypt, July 23, 1954. It's Revolution Day in Egypt, and the streets of Alexandria are teeming with revelers. Two men, Victor Levy and Philip Nadenson, pick their way through the crowd on their way to the cinema quarter, each nervously clutching a device in their pocket. Eyeing the fire trucks parked at the intersections, Philip leans over to Victor and whispers, "They're expecting us." They reach the steps of the Rio Cinema just as the audience from the afternoon showing begin pouring out of the entrance. They fight their way through the stream of people and into the foyer, and immediately see a man in the usual garb of an Egyptian plainclothes detective waiting for them. Philip turns to run away, but instantly a wave of heat begins to sear his thigh. He tries to tell Victor to run, but no words come out. Instead, a white-hot flame leaps from his trousers. He squeezes his thigh with all his strength in a vain attempt to stop the flame before the bomb can ignite, but it's too late. There's an explosion. Philip lies on the ground, his arms and legs burnt black from the bomb. Victor is nowhere to be seen. Soon, a police sergeant arrives, along with the plainclothes detective. Someone in the crowd shouts, "Take care, he may have another bomb." But the sergeant moves in all the same. "Don't worry, we were waiting for them." The police had been expecting them. Victor and Philip were Egyptian Jews, members of a sleeper cell established by Israeli military intelligence in 1951. The Israelis had watched in dismay as the military coup in Egypt in 1952 led to the rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was not only hostile to Israel, but who, as a perceived anti-communist, was securing military and financial aid from the Americans and even the British. With Britain already staging talks to withdraw from their Suez military base, Israel decided to act. In 1954, they activated their military intelligence sleeper cell in the country for an audacious mission. Codenamed Operation Susanna, their plan was to stage an increasingly spectacular series of bombings in Cairo and Alexandria. The first bombing, an explosion at the Alexandria Central Post Office on July 2nd, had gone off without a hitch. The second, a simultaneous attack on the American libraries in Cairo and Alexandria, was similarly successful. It was their third attack, an ambitious attempt to bomb 2 cinemas in Cairo, 2 in Alexandria, and the Cairo railway station, that failed, derailing the operation. 10 members of the cell were rounded up. Of the 10, 2 committed suicide in the course of their interrogations by the Egyptian police, 2 more were executed, and 6 were sentenced to prison, eventually making their way to Israel after their release. After decades of internal Israeli investigations, finger-pointing, political scandal, and high-profile resignations, the full truth of Operation Susanna remains shrouded in official secrecy. The Israeli government did not even formally acknowledge the incident until 2005, a full half-century after the affair, when 9 of the agents were officially commended for their service. But the reasoning behind the operation was revealed during one of the commissions of inquiry that was established to examine the affair. According to one officer who was given oral instructions directly from Israel's military intelligence chief, Benjamin Gibli, "Our goal is to break the West's confidence in the existing Egyptian regime. The action should cause arrests, demonstrations, and expressions of revenge. The Israeli origin should be totally covered, while attention should be shifted to any other possible factor. The purpose is to prevent economic and military aid from the West to Egypt." In short, the Israelis had attempted a false flag operation, hoping to blame their own spectacular acts of violence on the Muslim Brotherhood or the communists in order to destabilize Nasser's government, undermine Western confidence in its Egyptian ally, and persuade the British military to remain at their Suez base. The operation was a failure in every sense. The cell was discovered and its members imprisoned. Their actions did not destabilize the Nasser government, nor did they influence the relationship between Egypt and the West. And the British did leave their base in 1956, after an abortive Israeli-British-French invasion of the region was brought to an end by the US and the Soviets. But it did implant an idea in the minds of the Western military planners that acts of terrorism could be staged and blamed on Muslim scapegoats to further their own political goals. As we shall see, it was not long before America's military brass were forwarding their own operational plans making use of this tactic. Plans that would culminate in the most spectacular terrorist attack the world had yet seen. Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, dawned temperate and nearly cloudless in the eastern United States.
Miles and miles of sunshine. Miles Davis. We're going to put Miles out there today. Nice as it can be across the Northeast. Rough seas still from the chop from that hurricane. But other than that, it's kind of quiet around the country. We like quiet. It's quiet. It's too quiet.
In a matter of moments, however, the quiet of that Tuesday morning transformed into the turbulence of 9/11, and the world seemed to turn upside down. As the events of that day played out like a Hollywood movie on TV screens around the world, the meaning of those events was still far from clear. Who was behind this attack? Why were they attacking? What did the perpetrators hope to gain from it? And yet it was there, in the initial hours of those chaotic events, years before the congressional inquiries and presidential commissions presumed to answer those questions, that all of the essential pieces of the official story of 9/11 were laid out on the TV screens of the American public.
We want to tell you what we know as we know it. We just got a report in that there's been some sort of explosion at the World Trade Center in New York City. One report said, and we can't confirm any of this, that a plane may have hit one of the two towers of the World Trade Center. But again, you're seeing the live pictures here.
There was a pilot who flew. There was another one. We just saw another one. We just saw another one apparently go. Another plane just flew into the second tower. This has to be deliberate, folks.
Well, that would begin to say that, yeah.
We just saw on live television as a second plane flew into the second tower of the World Trade Center. Now, given what has been going on around the world, some of the key suspects come to mind: Osama bin Laden. Who knows what?
I was watching with my roommate. It was approximately several minutes after the first plane had hit. I saw this plane come out of nowhere and just ream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
I am sure the highest degree of probability associated with this attack, which had remarkable coordination and logistical sophistication, would be Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda group.
One senior U.S. intelligence official says now that the U.S. is 90% certain that bin Laden was responsible for today's attack.
He, an engineer and an architect, speculates here that the heat above the crash site on the Twin Trade Towers may have indeed caused the building above to melt, just simply collapsing in itself and putting enormous weight on the rest of the building below, which could not possibly stand it. And the steel columns which go up through the building, built to code at best, would only be able, he believes, to have been able to stand an hour and a half of intense fire like this, pressing down on the rest of the building until it finally was able to give way.
Remarkably, these initial off-the-cuff speculations turned out to be, according to the various inquiries and investigations that followed, accurate in all their main respects. Osama bin Laden, the mastermind of the Al-Qaeda terrorist organization, had planned and directed this attack. The Twin Towers had collapsed due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense. These assertions, drilled into the minds of a susceptible audience still reeling in shock from the horror of the events they had just witnessed, became the core tenets of what would become enshrined in the final report of the 9/11 Commission as the official story of 9/11. In this official story, Osama bin Laden, once the anti-Soviet warrior on the road to peace, was now an international terror kingpin. Radicalized by the arrival of U.S. military forces in the Arabian Peninsula in the Gulf War, he issued a fatwa against the United States and began a series of strikes on U.S. targets, first bombing the U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya in 1998, and then bombing the USS Cole while it was harbored in Aden in October of 2000. According to this version of events, the 9/11 plot was hatched by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, a highly educated Pakistani militant who presented the plane's operation, as the 9/11 Commission asserts it was originally known, to Osama bin Laden and his chief of operations, Mohammed Atef, in 1996. It was bin Laden, we are told, who greenlighted the operation sometime in late 1998 or early 1999. The three of them developed a list of buildings to be targeted: the White House, the U.S. Capitol, the Pentagon, and the World Trade Center, and bin Laden himself handpicked the men he wanted to carry out the operation. Carefully moving their operatives into place over the course of the next 2 years, this crack terror squad, devoted Muslim radicals willing to die for their beliefs, succeeded through a combination of skill and the colossal failure of the American intelligence complex, hindered by bureaucracy and hampered by a lack of political will to recognize the growing threat of Islamic terror. No individual was to blame for this failure, the official story of 9/11 concludes, but the remedy to the problems presented by the 9/11 attack was obvious: to erect a new homeland security complex, tear down the walls between foreign intelligence and domestic policing, implement warrantless surveillance and other legally dubious means of disrupting potential terror threats on the home front, and launch a war on terror abroad to bring the battle to the terrorists. But this narrative, now enshrined as the official history of 9/11, that the 9/11 plot was hatched by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in 1996, that it was directed by terrorist mastermind Osama bin Laden, and that it was executed by Al-Qaeda so flawlessly that the intelligence agencies could not have even envisioned it, let alone prevented it.
Nobody in our government, at least, and I don't think the prior government that could envision flying airplanes into buildings.
Bullshit.
Is now contested in every respect, even by defenders of that official history. As even mainstream authors like Jason Burke were forced to admit, the popular conception of Al-Qaeda, that of a top-down organization with a single leader overseeing its operations, was a convenient fiction created by the FBI so they could prosecute bin Laden in absentia for the 1998 bombings of 2 U.S. embassies in East Africa. In order to prosecute bin Laden, they had to show that Al-Qaeda coordinates the activities of its global membership, and that bin Laden, as the leader of the group, bears the responsibility for any actions attributed to the organization.
The idea, which is critical to the FBI's prosecution, that bin Laden ran a coherent organization with operatives and cells all around the world, of which you could be a member, is a myth. There is no Al-Qaeda organization. There is no international network with a leader, with cadres who will unquestioningly obey orders, with tentacles that stretch out to sleeper cells in America, in Africa, in Europe. That idea of a coherent, structured terrorist network with an organized capability simply does not exist.
But the U.S. government...
Even the 9/11 Commission's final report had to admit that Al-Qaeda was less of a mafia-like organization with a capo served by his faithful lieutenants, and more of a funding organization for terrorist entrepreneurs. Al-Qaeda's worldwide terrorist operations, the report conceded, relied heavily on the ideas and work of enterprising and strong-willed field commanders who enjoyed considerable autonomy. As we saw in part 1 of this exploration, Origin Story, these terrorist entrepreneurs included among their ranks renowned international Islamic radicals, like the blind sheikh Omar Abdel-Rahman, and lesser-known but incredibly prolific terror cell leaders, like Ali Mohammed, whose remarkable abilities to evade State Department watch lists and foment and direct spectacular terror attacks directly under the nose of the intelligence agencies defies explanation. Unless one assumes, as their closest associates did, that they were working under the purview of those intelligence agencies. In order to better understand this aspect of the story, we have to return to 1990, the year that the specter of Islamic terror appeared on the shores of the United States. Abdullah Azzam, Osama bin Laden's mentor and co-founder with bin Laden of the Maktab al-Khidmat, or the Office of Services, which provided funding, training, and an international support network to the Afghan Arabs during the Soviet-Afghan War, is dead, killed in a car bombing in Peshawar, Pakistan. It is never determined who committed the assassination, but Azzam's death resolves a dispute about the future of the jihad movement. Azzam had favored continuing the fight in Afghanistan, pressing for the formation of an Islamic regime in Kabul. Bin Laden had other ideas. And now, as the undisputed leader of the old MAK network, he is free to pursue those ideas under the Al-Qaeda banner. But Al-Qaeda, at this point, barely even exists as a propaganda construct. Despite grandiose visions of creating a unified global jihad movement, the withdrawal of the Soviets from Afghanistan and the end of the war leaves the group's future in doubt. Bin Laden returns to Saudi Arabia, looking for ways to leverage his family's wealth and power to make a name for himself in the Muslim world. Meanwhile, in New York, the era of Islamic terror in the United States is about to begin.
We have a rabbi shot in a Midtown hotel.
And the guy was running down the street, and the guy shot at the post office man, and it hit him in the arm.
For an hour later, at Bellevue Hospital, Mayor Kahane was pronounced dead from that gunshot wound.
Manhattan, New York, November 5th, 1990. Mayor Kahane, an Orthodox Jewish rabbi and a convicted terrorist whose anti-Arab views were considered so extreme he was banned from the Israeli Knesset, has just finished delivering a speech in the Morgan D. room of the New York Marriott East Side Hotel. Leaving the podium, Kahane has begun mingling with the crowd. Suddenly, one man, Saeed Nossair, draws a .357 Magnum and fires, hitting Kahane twice, once in the neck. Nossair flees, shooting one of Kahane's supporters in the leg in his rush out the door. His accomplice, Mahmoud Abu Halima, is supposed to be waiting at the front door in a taxi to drive him away, but the doorman had waved Abu Halima away moments earlier, so Nossair jumps in the wrong cab by mistake. When he realizes his error, he brandishes the .357, ordering the cabbie to start driving. Instead, the driver scrambles out of the taxi and runs away. Nossair is forced to flee on foot, racing down Lexington Avenue with his gun still in hand. Carlos Acosta, a U.S. postal inspector, tries to stop him, drawing his weapon, but it's too late. Nossair fires first, hitting Acosta in the shoulder. Undeterred, Acosta drops to his knee, steadies himself, and shoots back, hitting Nossair in the neck. Both Nossair and Kahane are rushed to Bellevue Hospital's trauma unit. Nossair survives his emergency operation. Kahane does not. The dramatic events of that November night would culminate in an even more surprising verdict 13 months later. Not only was Nossair treated as a lone gunman acting of his own accord, but he was not even convicted of Kahane's murder. Despite such a brazen assassination, perpetrated in a crowded room and followed by a spectacular chase, Nossair was acquitted of murder, convicted instead on 4 lesser counts, including gun possession, assault, and coercion. He was sentenced to just 22 years. So what went wrong? The jurors contend that they had reasonable doubt of Nossair's guilt, because the prosecution did not offer a witness during the 5-week trial who saw the defendant fire the fatal shots, and, since Kahane's family had opposed an autopsy, the fatal bullet could not be matched to Nossair's weapon. But, in reality, the fix was in from the start, as even the Congressional Joint Inquiry into the 9/11 attacks conceded in a staff statement a decade after the trial. According to FBI officials who were interviewed, the NYPD and the District Attorney's Office resisted attempts to label the Kahane assassination a conspiracy, despite the apparent links to a broader network of radicals. Instead, these organizations reportedly wanted the appearance of speedy justice and a quick resolution to a volatile situation. By arresting Nossair, they felt they had accomplished both. The typically bureaucratic wording of the statement obscures the reality. The NYPD and the District Attorney's Office didn't just passively resist the attempts to label the assassination a conspiracy. They deliberately covered up vitally important information that would have unwound that conspiracy and undermined the next decade of spectacular Al-Qaeda terrorism. Immediately after his arrest, 47 boxes of material were seized from Nossair's house in New Jersey. Among those materials were top-secret training manuals from Fort Bragg and secret communiques from the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. Lest there be any doubt where the materials came from, they even discovered a video of Ali Mohammed's lectures at the Kennedy Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg. But those weren't the only pieces of evidence that connected the Kahane assassination conspiracy, now commonly portrayed as the first act of Islamic terrorism on U.S. soil, to Ali Mohammed, the remarkable CIA asset, U.S. Army officer, and FBI informant who, we are told, was al-Qaeda's strangely untouchable triple agent in the heart of the American intelligence establishment. El Sayed Nosayir himself, the 34-year-old Egyptian-born janitor with a penchant for Prozac who quite literally got away with murder, was, as it turns out, not unknown to the authorities. In fact, he had been known to the FBI since at least the previous summer. That's when, as it was later admitted, Nosayir and a ragtag bunch of associates had been surveilled loading up a convoy of vehicles with semi-automatic weapons and copious amounts of ammo and heading to the Calverton shooting range on Long Island. For 4 consecutive Sundays in July of 1989, the FBI's Elite Special Operations Group, apparently tipped off that PLO terrorists were threatening to blow up casinos in Atlantic City, followed Nosayir's convoy to the shooting range, snapping dozens of photographs of the group engaging in target practice with handguns, rifles, and even an AK-47. The group had set off from the Brooklyn Al-Qifa Refugee Center, al-Qaeda's New York office, which, as we have seen, not only operated in full view of the intelligence community, but doubled as a recruiting post for the CIA seeking to steer fresh troops to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Among those in attendance at the FBI-surveilled target practice sessions, Nosayir himself, brandishing the chrome-plated .357 that he would later use to slay Kahane, Clement Rodney Hampton L., an American-born black Muslim medical technician known as Dr. Rashid, who claimed to have been wounded in Afghanistan, Mahmoud Abu Halima, known as the Red for his curly red hair, covered during the sessions by an NRA cap, Nidal Ayad, a Kuwaiti who had taken classes to become a U.S. citizen, and Mohammed Salameh, a Palestinian who grew up in Jordan and studied under Abdullah Azzam. Not present at those sessions in July, however, was the group's trainer, Ali Mohammed, the remarkable al-Qaeda triple agent who had been taking weekend breaks from his post at the heart of the U.S. Army's Special Forces Training Center at Fort Bragg to instruct the Al-Qifa cell in the techniques of guerrilla warfare, including bomb-making and weapons handling. Nosayir and his fellow Al-Qifa plotters had been under surveillance by the FBI. Mohammed, their handler, came straight from Fort Bragg, providing them with top-secret government documents and personally overseeing their training. But, incredibly, none of these points were raised at Nosayir's trial for the murder of Kahane. FBI officers who tried to follow the leads into the bigger plot were ordered to stand down.
What was your feeling about the lone gunman theory?
I thought it was preposterous, based on what my sources in the NYPD told me, that they were ordered to treat this as a simple homicide, based on what my sources in the FBI told me, that every time that they got a little bit ambitious and started broadening their investigation to search out El Sayed Nosayir's possible alleged terrorist links, they were told from atop to cool it, to stop investigating, that the NYPD would handle it as a simple homicide.
And, according to the official history, the boxes of Arabic documents seized from Nosayir's house were not translated until years later. Nosayir's not guilty verdict was cheered by his supporters, and the same cadre of Ali Mohammed-trained radicals who had been surveilled at the shooting range by the FBI moved on to plot their next spectacular terror attack: the bombing of the World Trade Center. And, as would be revealed in dramatic fashion years after the event, this plot, too, had an FBI informant at its heart.
Last winter, the FBI was praised for its speed in cracking the case of the World Trade Center bombing and bringing 4 suspects to trial. Now, there is some evidence that the FBI may have known of the plot in advance through an informant and might even have stopped the bombing that killed 6 people.
When Ahmad Salem, a former lieutenant colonel in the Egyptian army who arrived in the United States in 1988, began working as an FBI asset, he was not originally assigned to infiltrate Islamic terror groups. No, in 1988, the Cold War was still on, and the FBI tasked Salem with penetrating KGB and Russian mafia rings operating in New York City. But by 1991, things had changed. With the Cold War over, the Bureau's priorities were shifting. Salem's handler, Nancy Floyd, who appreciated his work, thought the Egyptian informant's background might make him useful to the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force. Salem's new handlers in the Bureau's counter-terror division, Louis Napoli and John Antisev, put him to work infiltrating the groups raising funds for international Islamic terror on U.S. soil. His first priority, insinuating himself into the ring around the blind sheikh, Omar Abdel Rahman, including El Sayed Nosair, then on trial for the slaying of Kahane, and his Calverton shooting range associates. Salem was remarkably successful in his assignment. Haunting the trial of Nosair, he soon befriended Nosair's cousin, Ibrahim El-Gabroni. El-Gabroni immediately took to the affable Egyptian, introducing Salem to Nosair in jail and describing him as a new member of the family. In a mere matter of weeks, Salem was caught on camera as one of Rahman's bodyguards, even personally driving the blind sheikh to Detroit to deliver fundraising speeches. Soon thereafter, El-Gabroni invited Salem to join him for dinner at his Brooklyn apartment. There, after turning up the television in the dining room, explaining that he feared the apartment was bugged, El-Gabroni sought to recruit Salem for a special mission.
I was in Brooklyn with Ibrahim El-Gabroni. Ibrahim El-Gabroni is Sayyid Nusayir's cousin. He said that we should start to do something, brother, so the government have some pressure and they don't put brother Sayyid in more troubles. So I said, sure, of course we should do something. He said, okay, do you know how to build a bomb? I said, of course, that's what we do. He said, okay, I want you to build some bombs and I'll tell you later, what do you need? So I said to Ibrahim El-Gabroni, I need explosives, I need detonators, I need people to help me build the bombs, I need a safe place to build the bomb in. He said, okay, let me make some phone calls to Afghanistan.
At this early stage, the plot was less of a precise plan and more of a vague idea, devoid of details. Even the target of the proposed attack was undecided, with Salem being told that the group intended to set off bombs at 12 Jewish locations, including temples, banks, and Jewish centers around Brooklyn and Manhattan. Without knowing it, and with hardly any effort, Salem had been recruited into an operation that would eventually result in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Salem worked the plot as best he could, meeting more of the Calverton shooting range associates and gathering information from the cell members to pass along to the Bureau. As the preparations for the bombing began to take shape, Salem's role in the FBI sting operation seemed clear. He would lead the cell along, swapping out the explosives for a harmless powder before the bombs were placed. Then, when the cell was ready to strike, the FBI would swoop in and round up the plotters. But that is not what happened. Salem's remarkable success in infiltrating an active plot to stage terror attacks in New York, something that most FBI assets fail to accomplish in the course of their career, is, in retrospect, stunning. But not as stunning as the FBI's response to this incredible turn of events. As author and journalist Peter Lance, who interviewed many of the FBI personnel involved in the story, explained in his book, Triple Cross, part of Salem's deal with the feds was that he would be a deep cover asset, as opposed to an informant who was willing to tape conversations and swear to his undercover evidence on the stand. Salem, who had family in Egypt, was deeply wary of the blind sheikh's deadly reach. So the Bureau promised him that he'd never have to wear a wire or testify in open court. But in June 1992, Carson Dunbar, a rising young star in the FBI's New York office, was appointed to head the counter-terror division. Dunbar and his deputy, John Krauthamel, didn't trust Salem. Soon they were trying to get him to submit to additional polygraphs, and, eventually, they broke their deal with Salem and demanded he wear a wire. Salem refused and withdrew from the operation, shutting the FBI out of the bomb plot.
It was a silly personal confrontation, and actually he said, and I quote him, "You son of a bitch, coming from the Middle East, dragging sand in your shoes all the way up to here to tell me how to run my FBI and how to do my job?" I told him, "Sir, I am doing your job. None of your agents could have went undercover that deep. I'm doing it. You're not. And that even provoked him more, and he said, get out of here. I walked out of his office. I looked at Nancy and John. I said, guys, when this bomb been built by somebody and goes off by somebody else, don't come knock on my door. And that was it. And I walked away.
With Salem out of the picture, the Ali Mohammed trained, blind sheikh supported, Al-Qifa connected cell continued on with their plot. But with internal disputes disrupting their plans, they had to find someone else to actually build the bomb. They found that person in Ramzi Youssef. To this day, despite having been caught, tried, and convicted for the World Trade Center bombing, little is known about Ramzi Youssef's origins or even his identity. The 9/11 Commission, relying on the torture testimony of his uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, identified him merely as a Sunni extremist whose real name was Abdul Basit. But this supposedly devout Muslim fundamentalist is reported to have hung out at karaoke bars and dated B-girls during his trips to the Philippines while his wife and daughters waited for him in Baluchistan. Even his birthplace remains a mystery. What is known is that Youssef learned bomb-making in Osama bin Laden's training camps in Afghanistan in the early 1990s, perhaps from Ali Mohammed himself. That in 1995, Newsday reported that the FBI was considering a probe of whether the CIA had any relationship with Youssef, and that in 1999, Swiss journalist Richard Lebevier reported that a classified FBI file indicates that he was recruited by the local branch of the CIA. And, like so many of the other key operatives in the al-Qaeda story, Youssef was able to avoid regular screening procedures, waltz across borders with forged travel documents, and enter the United States without a visa. On August 31st, 1992, Youssef and Ahmad Ajaj, a fellow mujahideen who Youssef had allegedly met at the training camps in Afghanistan, flew from Pakistan to the US despite lacking the proper travel documents to do so. A miraculous feat that the FBI has alleged was enabled by direct assistance from senior Pakistani intelligence officials. Upon their arrival at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York on September 1st, both men were immediately detained by immigration officials. Ajaj, acting loud and belligerent, was caught with a crudely forged Swedish passport and taken to a back office for questioning. The US government was pretty sure Ahmad Mohammed Ajaj was a terrorist from the moment he stepped foot on US soil, the Los Angeles Times later reported, noting that his suitcases were stuffed with fake passports, fake IDs, and a cheat sheet on how to lie to US immigration inspectors. But that wasn't all. Among his possessions, inspectors also found 2 handwritten notebooks filled with bomb recipes, 6 bomb-making guides that included pages from Fort Bragg military manuals, and 4 how-to videotapes concerning weaponry and surveillance training. Ajaj was charged with passport violations and sentenced to 6 months in prison. Youssef, meanwhile, tried a different approach. Dressed in traditional peasant garb and carrying an Iraqi passport without a US visa, Youssef strode confidently up to the immigration inspector and declared himself to be a refugee seeking asylum from the oppressive Iraqi government, politely asking to be admitted into America. After being questioned and fingerprinted, one alert immigration official noted his links to Ajaj and sought to detain him, but there was not enough room in the INS lockup, so he was released on the condition that he show up at an asylum hearing later. Youssef then left the airport, took a cab to New York's East Village, and immediately met with Mahmoud Abu Hulima, the Red, who had trained with Ali Mohammed and who had served as the getaway driver for Nosair before being waved away by the hotel doorman. Youssef set about professionalizing the ragtag band of misfits, transforming their vague Jewish locations plot into an altogether more ambitious plan. To plant a bomb in the basement of one of the twin towers of the World Trade Center, collapsing it into the other tower and killing tens of thousands in the process. He got to work immediately, organizing the cell, renting a storage locker across the Hudson River in Jersey City, and beginning the 5-month task of constructing the bomb. Without Salem, the FBI ostensibly no longer had an asset in the cell to watch as the plot took shape. But if there had been a serious investigation underway, unraveling the cell and discovering their intentions would have been trivial. Ahmad Ajaj, who had been caught with a raft of terrorist training materials and making guides, remained in contact with Youssef the whole time, speaking to him frequently via the prison phone. But although those calls were taped, no one from the FBI or any other agency monitored or even attempted to translate those phone calls until after the World Trade Center explosion the following February, and no one traced the pair's flights back to discover that they had both boarded in Pakistan without the proper travel documents and had even sat together for the first leg of their journey to New York. Salem even tried one last time to warn the FBI about the cell. Meeting his old handler, Nancy Floyd, at a Subway sandwich shop near the FBI's New York office in October of 1992 to collect his final $500 cash payment, he informed her that he had heard that the group was planning a new attack and begged her to put surveillance on Abu Halima and Salameh. But it was no use. Carson Dunbar had taken her off the terror investigation, and all she could do was pass along the suggestion. Salem's warning was ignored, and no one followed up on the lead. The FBI had followed the Al-Qifa plotters to the shooting range, investigated their role in the Kahane murder, had an informant in their midst reporting on their plans for a spectacular terror attack, and now another high-level terror operative had been allowed to enter the country and proceed with his activities unmolested, just as Ali Mohammed and the blind sheikh before him. And so it was that at noon on February 26, 1993, Ramzi Youssef and Iyad Ismail, a Jordanian associate, drove a yellow Ryder van into the underground parking garage of the World Trade Center, parking on the B2 level. Youssef ignited the 20-foot fuse and fled. 12 minutes later, the bomb went off.
We think a bomb caused this explosion.
The floor seemed to have exploded down and collapsed into the level below that.
The Department of Justice and the FBI are operating on the very educated assumption that this was the work of a terrorist bomber.
And we're also told now that there are 4 people confirmed
We
dead.
call this the terror at the tower. And from now on, people in there are going to feel even more vulnerable than they've ever felt before.
The bomb, cutting through the parking garage with an explosive force of 150,000 pounds per square inch, might have lacked the explosive force to fulfill Youssef's goal of toppling the towers, but it did wreak havoc. 6 people died, over 1,000 were injured, and 50,000 were forced to evacuate the building in the chaotic aftermath of the explosion. Learning of the bombing, Bruce Hoffman, a terrorism expert working for the Rand Corporation, remarked, "We may be talking about the opening salvo of a new conflict for a new world order." As the investigation into the bombing began, a letter arrived in the offices of various New York newspapers claiming responsibility for the attack. The letter, sent under the name Liberation Army, 5th Battalion, issued 3 demands: end U.S. aid to Israel, end diplomatic relations with Israel, and stop interfering with the internal affairs of Middle Eastern nations. If these demands were not met, the letter promised that 150 suicide soldiers would be ready to commit more attacks, including launching strikes on potential nuclear targets. If there was any doubt about who was behind the explosion, those doubts were quickly dispelled. Just 2 days into the investigation, in one of the FBI's first descents into the pitch-black, smoke-filled 5-story crater left by the blast, an explosives enforcement officer from the ATF found the proverbial needle in the haystack, apart from the Ryder van itself bearing a vehicle identification number. The van rental was traced back to Mohammed Salameh, one of Ali Mohammed's trainees from the Al-Qifa Center. Absurdly, Salameh was apprehended on March 4th, 1 week after the bombing, when he returned to the Ryder rental office in Jersey City to reclaim the deposit on the van. Salameh's arrest quickly led to the arrest and eventual conviction of 3 others in the Al-Qifa cell: Nid al-Ayad, Mahmoud Abu Halima, and Ahmad Ajaj. It also led investigators to the apartment of Ramzi Youssef. But it was too late. Ramzi Youssef had boarded a flight to Karachi the night of the bombing and then vanished, flying from country to country with impunity, plotting assassinations and bombings in Pakistan, Thailand, the Philippines, and Iran, and concocting an elaborate plot called Bojinka to blow up a number of airliners in mid-flight before finally being captured in Pakistan in 1995. But it was not just Youssef himself, the mysteriously protected terror mastermind who had entered the US without a visa, who vanished. When Pakistani federal investigators later went to check their immigration records, they discovered that all of the documents pertaining to Yousef's journey to the United States in 1992, including his embarkation card, had mysteriously disappeared. In the wake of the bombing, the FBI, now facing enormous public pressure to round up those involved and bust the terror cell that they had infiltrated and abandoned just the year before, turned once again to Ahmad Salem. Once again, Salem was able to quickly penetrate the Blind Sheikh cell and to begin working with them on a new scheme, the so-called Landmarks plot, to bomb key targets around New York City, including the UN headquarters, the Lincoln Tunnel, and the George Washington Bridge. This time, the FBI arrested the plotters before they could stage their attack. But at the trial 2 years later, Salem had a surprise for the prosecution. He had secretly recorded dozens...
What did he secretly record? I'm going to stop sharing just for a bit. Long video. It's a rest day for me from the gym anyway. I went too heavy yesterday. But anyway, I want to get into some more ChatGPT conversations. Operation Susanna, more commonly known as the Lavon Affair, which I've talked about before, was a failed Israeli covert operation conducted in Egypt during the summer of 1954. The operation aimed to disrupt Egypt's relation with Western powers, particularly the United States and the UK, by staging attacks that would be attributed to local insurgents. Backgrounds and objectives. In the early 1950s, Israel was concerned about the potential withdrawal of British forces from the Suez Canal zone. It was talked about in this documentary. I just wanted to reinforce some points here as well that were missed. Fearing it would leave Israel vulnerable to Egyptian aggression. To prevent this, Israel military intelligence sought to undermine Western confidence in Egypt's stability. The plan involved recruiting Egyptian Jews to form a covert cell known as Unit 131, tasked with carrying out bombings and acts of sabotage targeting Egyptian, American, and British civilian facilities and Canadian, including cinemas, libraries, and educational centers. The intent was to blame these attacks on the Muslim Brotherhood, communists, or other local groups, thereby creating a pretext for continued British military presence in the region. Execution and failure, he's already covered that quite a bit. And so this is news. So did France just park a nuclear-armed sub off the coast of Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada? Yes, the French Navy's nuclear-powered attack submarines, FS Tourville, recently docked in Halifax, Nova Scotia. This visit is part of a broader initiative to strengthen defense and security cooperation between France and Canada. Oh my God, this is just so ridiculous. We have Macron, Brigitte Macron, being a man that was significantly older than Emmanuel, 14 years old when he was in his 40s. This guy pretending to be a woman, lying, and Canada, we're going to align ourselves with that instead of aligning ourselves with our greatest ally, which is the U.S. Just absolutely ridiculous to me. Because what if this is considered some kind of a show of force or an escalation of force or something like that? This could be completely taken out of context by people that always do, right? There's so much propaganda and psyops and division, fear mongering that goes on in mainstream media, and ridiculous. This could further dismantle any form of coordination we can do with the U.S. Specifications: the FS Tourville is a Suffren-class nuclear-powered attack submarine, measuring 99 meters in length and displacing 5,200 tons when submerged. It is equipped with naval cruise missiles, F-21 heavy wire-guided torpedoes, and Exocet SM-39 anti-ship missiles. It's not equipped with nuclear ballistic missiles. Okay, good. But it is classified as an attack submarine. Its armaments are conventional, designed for tactical engagements rather than strategic nuclear deterrence. It's going to be here until the 21st of March, I believe. Yeah. Okay, so now I want to get into social media. It's just a breakup. It's going to be a long video, but everything in one place. I like to do that because a lot of truth could be coming out. Oh no, I'll do this one first. I was going to show Candace Owens, but I'll show. This is Danielle Smith, Premier of Alberta, and and she wasn't attacking Trump this time, which is good, and but she had a lot of good points to make.
has a secret weapon in this trade conflict with the United States, a trump card, so to speak. And it is located directly under our feet, and it is called Alberta Energy. You see, Alberta happens to have one of the largest deposits of oil and natural gas on the planet. It is significantly larger and far more accessible than the quickly declining oil and gas reserves located in the United States. Whether the US president wishes to admit it or not, the United States not only needs our oil and gas today, they are also going to need it more and more with each passing year once they notice their declining domestic reserves and production are wholly insufficient to keep up with the energy demands of US consumers and industry, let alone having anything left over to export as they do today. We in Alberta would love to increase the amount of oil and gas we send to our southern neighbors to help solve that problem for them. Currently, they buy about $100 billion a year of highly discounted oil from Alberta, which tens of thousands of US workers and refineries then upgrade into $300 billion worth of value to sell around the world. We have made a lot of Americans very wealthy. It's in both of our countries' best interests to double the amount of Canadian crude moving south. It means more Canadian jobs and even more American jobs. It means lower fuel prices for consumers and more US and Canadian influence all around the world. Canada has a secret weapon.
You know, and I was listening to Pierre in his speech yesterday, and I honestly, I loved it. And I know people, like I've said, there's red flags because of propaganda that the party has said, I guess, or made public regarding Ukraine, Russia, regarding the Middle East, regarding Israel, Palestine, and like the support that's going towards this, including Bill Blair, right, conservative, and Premier Doug Ford, and like these people are in support, Larry Brock, in support of proxy wars that are not helping anyone. It's and in my opinion, these are crimes against humanity that are being committed, and that we're further Nazifying the friggin' world by allowing this to happen. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's actually true, and I've given the receipts, which is anyway interesting in itself. I wanted to go into my Instagram. Yeah, Stephen Guilbeault.
I'm told is getting larger responsibilities, and he would be. If you're staying, you're getting more work.
Yeah,
because there.
Yeah, Stephen Guilbeault.
The way things are going, we're not going to have any free.
Give me a minute. I'm going to blow your mind. This guy right. Give me a minute. I'm going to blow your mind. This guy right here, he just did the most incredible investigative work I think I've seen.
He hasn't seen my work yet. In his
got tipped off about this website, which is the White House. In there, they noticed Mark Carney's name of Brookfield Asset Management. That was related to the Panama Canal. And then he came across this. This is a report done just in 2023 called the Center for International Corporate Accountability and Research. And they looked into Brookfield, the company that Mark Carney was the chairman of. And this whole report talks about how Brookfield might be the largest tax dodger in Canada. Watch this. And it literally talks about exploiting loopholes in national and global tax system. And this report goes into crazy detail. And the report talks about the 48 companies they have incorporated in Bermuda in order to dodge taxes. So he actually did a lookup. He went to the government of Bermuda's website. He typed in Brookfield, and sure enough, he found all 48. Brookfield Strategic Real Estate Partners. Like, look at them all. These are all different entities with different registration dates, and it talks about how Brookfield uses these tax havens, and it accuses them of being Canada's largest tax dodger. Now, it says in Canada, Brookfield Asset Management, now Brookfield Corporation, has paid relatively little tax on very large profits. A 2017 report by Canadian for Tax Fairness outlined how large Canadian corporations are able to use complex loopholes in corporate structures to reduce the effective tax rate in their home country. And it says a key method to avoid taxes is to set up subsidiary companies in tax havens like Bermuda, because dividends from foreign subsidiaries to Canadian parent companies are tax free. And this is where it gets good. Brookfield's estimated tax rate is around 5% over the last 15 years. And it highlights a clear long-term structural problems which appear to be driven by aggressive global tax avoidance practices. According to their analysis, they found that the gap was nearly over $6.5 billion, with more than half of the total in most recent year. This is the amount of what they're accusing.
So many companies are doing that, like these, like I'm talking about the ones where there's unethical people that are like psyopsing people and manipulating stats and all that stuff. Bill Gates, how many jobs has he lost Americans with Microsoft, with like with again hiring in places like India, just so he could cheap labor and to avoid paying the what he considers to be high taxes in America. And so everyone's propping him up as some kind of a philanthropist. He's not. I will reiterate, he's on the friggin' list. Anyway. And Fauci as well. Just ridiculous. Just the amount of crime there is at the top.
Give me a minute. I'm going to blow.
Criminal mind is all I... Would you like to see Mr. Carney get rid of the consumer carbon tax before the federal election is called?
Yes. The greatest deception. The greatest deception in modern history is convincing people that issues are about left or right. It's not. I got called onto the news to comment on the stuff that's going on. They're raiding this USAID building, and these mostly Democratic Congress people are out there screaming and yelling and protesting and saying they're destroying the country. And they're asking me to go down that narrative. And it's a left versus right narrative, which doesn't exist. It does not exist. I promise you, it does not exist. And the more you learn about psychology, brainwashing, and behavior, the more you realize that is an illusion. So what I said was that you're focusing all these people that are screaming and loud and protesting, and that's great, because when corruption is being pointed out and people are screaming about it, that might be where you need to focus some attention. I'm sure there's some programs that got cut that were beneficial, positive, but you have to be able to see that from both sides. There's good and there's bad. If you can't see good and bad, something is wrong. But they focus on all these people screaming and throwing fits and stuff.
And to be clear, he's not even just talking about the people like the elected officials and people in Senate and cabinet, people that are voting on policies and mandates and stuff like that. He's talking about everyone. Like there's like the bipartisan rulership, or whatever you want to call it, has been it's not there. It's been gridlocked. It's ridiculous. Like, I don't know. It's hard to explain. It's very divisive.
But what about on the other side of the aisle? You need to focus on the people that are very quiet. That's the truth. So there's two things that are true, right? Can I see good? Can I see bad? And do I realize that the greatest deception that I will never fall for again, believing that everything is about right versus left?
Yeah.
There's good in both. There's bad in both. And if you can't see it, something is wrong. The greatest,
so many
the greatest.
It's just that.
Oh, this might get me off.
It's just that I think the public needs to be informed. We need to be told the benefits versus the risk. We need to know what we're facing.
Well, the darker side of the polio vaccine, and what nobody knows, is that Jonas Salk has pointed out that in the last 10 years in this country, 2/3 of all the cases of polio have been vaccine-induced.
How many cases is that, Bob? How many cases, Bob?
Would you not interrupt me for a second? I know that doctors are used to interrupting patients, but not another doctor.
Especially another doctor.
Chief, I think, but let's get. He does make a point that we should also say Sabin is live and live vaccine, and Salk is
inactive.
Is inactive, as we say in the laboratory. All right. How many was it? They ask.
Well, how many people know that the European epidemic of polio, there were about 20 or 30 cases in this country. Now, of course, the American doctors will argue that the reason why polio disappeared in this country was because of the vaccine. But then why did it disappear in Europe in the 1940s and the 1950s without mass vaccination? Why doesn't it occur in the third world where only 10% of the people have ever been immunized against polio or anything else?
So, in other words, we may be fighting a tiger that died.
That's quite correct.
Ask the people in Great Britain. Ask the people in Japan who...
Back here. Gentlemen, if you please. I've got probably the smartest audience we've ever had.
I have a question. How long a delayed action, if any, would you connect this with, like MS?
Is MS a possibility? Would multiple sclerosis be one of the possible results?
As a matter of fact, there's a new publication that just came out from John Hoffman, who's a close associate of Toni Morris's, that gives the references linking MS in later life to the early introduction of live virus vaccines like measles and like some of the others that are live viruses. Now, at the present time, I would recommend that anybody who has MS or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or any of those degenerative neurologic conditions of later life carefully review their vaccine histories.
I would also like to comment to that because in connection with my case, I've been doing some research.
Let me tell him once again, Ms. Gundy, that you're a Guillain-Barré victim contracted following your receipt of the swine flu vaccination.
Yes, and I am in the process of writing a book about my experience, and in the process, I've done considerable research. And from what I have learned, it looks as if immunizations frequently cause autoimmune diseases, not only Guillain-Barré syndrome, but lupus, rheumatoid.
Sorry, I got distracted.
It's just that I think the public needs.
All right. So I was having a conversation because my best friend, like once I shared that as well on my social media, she was saying that her sister had Guillain-Barré syndrome when she was 20 years old, and it took her 4 months in order to be able to learn how to walk again. And she's told me this story before, but she was telling me again, and it's, every time I freaking hear it, it's just like it blows my mind. And yeah, Candace Owens talking about possible cyber attacks. I've been talking about this for years as well. I totally agree with a lot of what she is sharing here, and why it's important is I hope more people become aware of channels like mine and start maybe even providing your own archive, because if there is some kind of a cyber attack, I'm assuming it's going to be targeting major accounts or accounts where there's like more like truth exposers. And then when it comes back up, like I think a lot of these channels will be removed, videos removed. And so the more people that, archive these videos, the good ones, look for and then fact check videos that you're sharing as well. Make sure that it's as credible as it can be. And that may help. But yeah, it's happened before. It'll happen again. Oh.
And by they, I mean if the government purposefully brought the power grid down. And I'm not asking that question for fun. I'm asking that question because the World Economic Forum is predicting that a cyber pandemic, you can look this up, they've been running exercises about it this year, is inevitable. You're probably saying, what is a cyber pandemic? It doesn't make any sense. Like, what are we even talking about? Well, first and foremost, the reason I'm even paying attention to the World Economic Forum and their exercises is because they notoriously, in 2019, ran an exercise for a coronavirus pandemic that oddly all became true. I mean, without one slight difference, they said that the coronavirus was going to escape from a wet market in South America. Of course, when the coronavirus swept the world in 2020, they said that it escaped from a wet market in China. You can still look that up, by the way. That's not a conspiracy theory. They simulated that coronavirus pandemic. It was the World Economic Forum in collaboration with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation
and the World Health
in collaboration with Johns Hopkins University.
Yeah.
And the website is still up, and they say, a coronavirus pandemic is inevitable. And then boom, it happened the very next year. So people say it's a conspiracy theory to believe that they knew that the coronavirus pandemic was going to happen. You don't have to believe it was a conspiracy theory, or you can believe it wasn't a conspiracy theory. It's up to you. I don't really care. The point is that they made the prediction, they called it inevitable, and then it happened immediately. So for me personally, that signals to me that I should probably pay attention the next time the World Economic Forum makes a prediction and calls it inevitable.
Yep.
And lo and behold, they are predicting that a coronavirus pandemic, a cyber pandemic, is going to happen, and that it is once again inevitable. So if you look into the exercise that they have run this year, I believe they ran it in July. They've been meeting and talking about the cyber pandemic, what it would look like. Essentially, their idea is that they're going to have to sanitize the internet because a bug, think of it as like a coronavirus for your
I have so many videos on this. Take a look at my older videos.
Computer.
So many videos.
Is going to sweep globally, and the only way they're going to be able to stop this bug from infecting everything is to effectively shut down the internet, right? And they were talking about bringing down the power grid in an effort to do this. So imagine the government bringing down the power grid, and you would not have access to anything that required an electrical charge. What would you do if they brought?
She is so smart. She does not shy away from looking into the research, no matter how hard it is, because it's necessary. And she cares about the future of her country as well as I.
dozens of phone conversations with his FBI handlers. Conversations that revealed for the first time the FBI's real role in the World Trade Center bombing.
FBI agents might have been able to prevent last February's deadly explosion at New York's World Trade Center. They discussed secretly substituting harmless powder for the explosives, but they didn't, according to the FBI's own informant, Imad Salem. Unbeknownst to the FBI at the time, Salem recorded many of his conversations with his handlers.
I'm holding 903 pages of draft transcripts.
William Kunstler represents Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman and several others charged with conspiring to blow up a series of New York City landmarks 4 months after the World Trade Center bombing. That case has not yet gone to trial. Kunstler confirmed newspaper reports of the Salem transcripts. In one, Salem complains to an FBI agent, "Since the bomb went off, I feel terrible. I feel bad. I feel here is people who don't listen." The agent replies, "Hey, I mean, it wasn't like you didn't try and I didn't try. You can't force people to do the right thing."
Predictably, in the wake of the blast, the debate began to center on the government's mismanagement of the case. The Blackjake's entry to the U.S. had been a mistake. The NYPD's refusal to investigate No Sayer's accomplices in the killing of Kahane had just been a politically expedient omission. The FBI having pulled their informant out of an active terror plot before it developed into the World Trade Center bombing was simply incompetence.
Right.
The presence of a CIA-linked Fort Bragg-stationed Green Beret in the midst of this radical terror cell was just an example of blowback. And Ramzi Youssef's miraculous ability to enter and leave countries at will without the proper documentation was just the result of bureaucratic bungling and overworked immigration officials. The admissions of error and professions of blowback verged on admissions of guilt. Even the CIA, in an internal investigation into its role in supporting the Al-Qifa Center's operations, concluded that the agency itself was partly culpable for the World Trade Center bombing. But the incompetence narrative soon arrived at its inevitable conclusion. The very agencies that had signally bungled every step along this path were now to be given more money and bestowed more authority to conduct their counter-terror operations.
This year, I'll submit to Congress comprehensive legislation to strengthen our hand in combating terrorists, whether they strike at home or abroad. As the cowards who bombed the World Trade Center found out, this country will hunt down terrorists and bring them to justice.
Others proposed a less charitable reading of these events. Ron Kuby, the lawyer who, along with William Kunstler, acted as a defense lawyer for the accused bombers and their accomplices, did not mince words in assigning blame for the World Trade Center bombing plot. The mastermind of the plot is the government of the United States. It was a phony, government-engineered conspiracy to begin with. It would never have amounted to anything had the government not planned it. Imad Salem himself summarized the story of the World Trade Center bombing in a phone call with his FBI handler, John Antisev, that was later released to the public.
I don't think it was. If that's what you think, guys, fine. But I don't think that, because we was start already building the bomb, which is went off in the World Trade Center. It was built by supervision from the Bureau and the DA, and we was all informed about it, and we know that the bomb start to be built. By who? By your confidential informant. What a wonderful, great case. And then he put his head in the sand and said, "Oh, no, that's not true. He is son of a bitch." Okay, it's built with a different way in another place, and that's it.
If this pattern of missed opportunities and miraculous cross-border movements really had been the result of mere incompetence or inattentiveness, then the resources and attention that were thrown at the problem of international terrorism in the wake of the World Trade Center bombing would have improved the intelligence agency's record against their erstwhile foes. But, remarkably, the scarcely believable trend of the early 1990s, that of intelligence agencies consistently missing the terrorists operating directly under their nose, border agents allowing known terrorists to pass from country to country unmolested, and law enforcement officials letting these Al-Qaeda-linked operatives off the hook, did not just continue into the late 1990s, the trend actually accelerated. And, As al-Qaeda went from a loose-knit group of a few dozen amateur mujahideen at the beginning of the decade to the premier international terrorist organization at the end of the decade, the number of mistakes and missed opportunities multiplied from the merely unbelievable to the downright impossible. When Mahmoud Abu Halima was arrested for his part in the World Trade Center plot in 1993, he attempted to bargain with federal prosecutors. Abu Halima revealed the name of Wadi al-Hajj, a Lebanese-born naturalized American citizen living in Texas, who the Al-Qifa cell had turned to for help in purchasing weapons, and recounted his experiences in Afghanistan with Mohammed Odeh, a Palestinian from Jordan who would later claim to have provided the rifles and rocket launchers that killed 18 U.S. soldiers and wounded 73 in Mogadishu in October of 1993. Abu Halima then offered more information about the World Trade Center plot and his associates in exchange for a lighter sentence. Prosecutors turned down the deal and failed to follow up on either El-Hajj or Odeh. Ali Mohammed, meanwhile, continued in his remarkably successful mission to infiltrate the intelligence arms of the U.S. government. After having worked for the CIA and served as a Special Forces instructor at Fort Bragg, his next target was the FBI. Following his honorable discharge from the Army, Mohammed returned to his wife in California and applied to be a translator for the Bureau. He was turned down for the position. Instead, he was asked to work as an FBI informant in a local document forgery ring. In 1992, the Bureau, evidently impressed with Mohammed's work, opened him as a foreign counterintelligence agent and tasked him with gaining intelligence on a San Jose mosque. But Mohammed was assigned to a rookie agent, and routine steps like administering a polygraph were never taken. As a retired special agent who worked in the FBI's New York office later told journalist Peter Lance, "One of the most unbelievable aspects of the Ali Mohammed story is that the Bureau could be dealing with this guy and they didn't put him on the box. The first thing you do with any kind of asset or informant is you polygraph him, and if the relationship continues, you make him submit to continued polygraphs down the line. That is a basic principle of running informants." Still, despite repeatedly traveling back and forth to and from the Middle East throughout the period, Mohammed remained untouchable by law enforcement and border security. In 1992, he was detained in Rome when he was discovered with a Coca-Cola can containing a secret storage compartment. Mohammed convinced the airport security that he was a security agent for the Summer Olympics in Barcelona and was released with a warning that if anything happened on the flight, he would be blamed. In 1993, after helping Ayman al-Zawahiri enter the US on forged documents for a fundraising tour, Mohammed traveled to Vancouver, Canada to help an associate of Zawahiri, Essam Marzouk, enter the country. Marzouk, caught with forged Saudi passports by Canadian customs officials, was detained by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. When Mohammed arrived inquiring about his friend, he was detained by the RCMP as well.
Royal Canadian Mounted
Police.
After
hours of interrogation, he told them he was an
Canada. Royal Canadian Mounted Police.
FBI asset, giving them the phone number of his handler, John Zent. Zent's word was good enough. The RCMP let Mohammed go.
Should not have done that.
Mohammed's travels during this busy period included a trip to Afghanistan in the summer of 1991 to help Osama bin Laden and his fledgling al-Qaeda organization relocate to Sudan. Osama's move to Sudan came at a time when, we are told, the wealthy Saudi was looking to cement his reputation as a holy warrior. The official story of al-Qaeda holds that during this period, bin Laden returned briefly to Saudi Arabia, but, incensed by the Saudi royals' decision to invite U.S. soldiers onto Saudi soil for the Gulf War, left the country for good. Searching for a place to move his operations, his gaze turned across the Red Sea to Sudan, where, as luck would have it, hardline Islamic extremist Hassan al-Turabi had come to power in a military coup just as the war was ending in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Heading the National Islamic Front Party, which sought to impose Sharia law in the country, al-Turabi traveled to London for a meeting of the International Muslim Brotherhood, where he openly declared his intention to allow Sudan to act as a base for Islamist terror groups. By the summer of 1991, Osama bin Laden had answered that call, moving his fighters and equipment from the outskirts of Afghanistan to his new base in Sudan, with the help of FBI asset Ali Mohammed. Turabi was not the only one traveling to London to foster his terror plans, however. In between bin Laden's work establishing himself as a businessman in Sudan, using $12 million granted him by the Saudi bin Laden Group to start a bewildering array of commercial enterprises in the country, From a construction company to an investment firm to a trucking business to a tannery, a bakery, a furniture-making business, and even a commercial farm employing 4,000 laborers, the budding terrorist mastermind was, according to numerous sources, shuttling back and forth between Khartoum, Karachi, and London. Osama bin Laden's visits to the UK in the early 1990s include an alleged stay at the London estate of Saudi billionaire Khalid bin Mahfouz, a meeting in Manchester with representatives of an Algerian Islamic group who were later accused of being infiltrated by government moles and used to launch a series of false flag attacks in France, a period of several months in 1994 where he actually lived in the UK, allegedly buying a house in Wembley through an intermediate, and, even more explosively, a 1996 trip to his London press office, which was, according to Swiss journalist Richard Lebevier, citing several Arab diplomatic sources, clearly under the protection of the British authorities.
Excuse me.
Although the official story holds that bin Laden was, at this time, barely a blip on the US intelligence community's radar, this is contradicted by numerous lines of evidence. Ali Mohammed, for instance, had volunteered the earliest insider description of al-Qaeda that is publicly known to the FBI in 1993, telling them that bin Laden was building an army to overthrow the Saudi government and admitting that he had personally trained terrorists at the camps in Afghanistan and Sudan. But the FBI, according to the Wall Street Journal, was flummoxed by this information and made no attempt to act on it. This news about al-Qaeda's activities would not have been news to the US government's main intelligence agencies, however. It was later revealed that, despite claims that the US government was only dimly aware of bin Laden at this point, he was in fact already under extensive electronic surveillance. Having obtained his voice print from recordings of his anti-Saddam speeches in Saudi Arabia, the NSA and CIA were already using signals intelligence to identify and monitor bin Laden's personal satellite calls and cell phone traffic. In another key contradiction that is never addressed by the purveyors of the official al-Qaeda story, it was during this period that Osama bin Laden, making trips to the UK under the alleged protection of British authorities and while admittedly under surveillance by American intelligence, began the streak of increasingly brazen terror attacks that, we are told, would end up in 9/11. In 1992, al-Qaeda mounted their first terror operation against an American target. In December of that year, bombs went off outside 2 hotels in Aden, where, it was believed, American servicemen were being quartered on their way to Somalia for Operation Restore Hope. The attack killed an Australian tourist and a Yemeni hotel worker, but no Americans. The troops had been staying at a different hotel. Osama only claimed responsibility for the bombing 6 years later. In 1993, 18 American soldiers were killed and 73 wounded in Mogadishu during an intense 2-day firefight that resulted in the downing of 2 Black Hawk helicopters by rocket-propelled grenades. It wasn't until the release of the 9/11 Commission report in 2004, however, that the Commission, citing new information received by the intelligence community in 1996-1997, told the public that al-Qaeda had had a role in the incident. The burnishing of bin Laden's terrorist credentials by the US government continued in 1996. In January of that year, the CIA officially opened Alex Station, a so-called virtual station dedicated solely to tracking Osama bin Laden and his associates. Headed at first by Michael Scheuer, an analyst at the CIA's Counterterrorism Center who had taken a special interest in the Saudi exile, and named after Scheuer's son, Alex Station soon became the hub for a mostly female group of analysts who dubbed themselves the Manson family because they had acquired a reputation for crazed alarmism about the rising al-Qaeda threat. 1996 was also the year that the US government began putting diplomatic pressure on Sudan to hand over their files on bin Laden and his al-Qaeda operatives. The secret negotiations between the two countries culminated with al-Fatih Irwa, Sudan's then Minister of State for Defense, flying from Khartoum to Washington. There, Irwa made a stunning offer. Not to turn over the Sudanese government's records on bin Laden, but to turn over bin Laden himself. Washington rejected the offer because, the Village Voice later reported, the FBI did not believe it had sufficient evidence to try bin Laden in a US court. Instead, they demanded that Sudan expel the supposed arch-terrorist to any other country except Somalia. Sudan complied, protesting that Osama would simply return to Afghanistan where there was no government for Washington to negotiate with. We told him Sudan is no longer safe for him and creates problems for us and asked him to leave, Irwa told the Village Voice. We liquidated everything, and he left with his money. We didn't confiscate anything because there was no legal basis. Nobody had indicted him. He rented a charter plane and left in broad daylight. He was free to plot and build his network. The Americans then came back and wanted us to help track him, but by then it was too late. He didn't trust us anymore. In June of 1996, a truck bomb exploded outside of the Khobar Towers in Darhan, Saudi Arabia. The facility, located in the heart of the Saudi oil industry's administrative area, where the U.S. had built its first airbase and where Standard Oil first struck oil in the country, establishing what would later become Aramco, was housing U.S. and allied forces involved in enforcing the Iraqi no-fly zones. The massive blast left an 85-foot crater, killing 19 and injuring hundreds. At the time, the U.S. blamed Tehran for the bombing, with Clinton's defense secretary William Perry later admitting that there was a contingency plan in place to attack Iran if the link had been proven. But by 2007, Perry had changed his assessment.
I believe that the Khobar Tower bombing was probably masterminded by Osama bin Laden. I can't be sure of that, but in retrospect, that's what I believe. At the time, he was not a suspect. At the time, all of our examinations, all of the evidence was pointing to Iran.
One thing is for certain. In 1998, the $150 million contract to rebuild the Khobar Towers was awarded to the Saudi bin Laden Group.
It's frozen. Hmm. 2 hours 15 in. I'm just gonna refresh it. Still not going. This might be a sign. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing just for a minute, just to see if on my end I can get it to go. It's a lot. And I've talked about organizational betrayal, especially people that have served in various capacities, just like understanding or realizing just how deep the rabbit hole goes and who is involved. It's blue on blue. And blue on green, blue on red. Oh, I thought I was going to play. Maybe if I disconnect from Canada. I'm just going to check this. Just hold on. And then I won't. I'll refresh once more. No, so I guess it will be to be continued. I might try to pop on later and finish it. You're welcome to go on your own and watch it. It's called False Flags, The Secret History of Al-Qaeda, the Corbett Report. And this is also from Just a Dude, because again, I'm taking a lot of time to look through a lot of his work or the work from that channel and try to share or archive any videos that I think are really important right now to know. And I'm taking notes and stuff like that as well, because in case there is some kind of like a cyber attack or a power grid failure, they're going to blame on other people, and it's going to be within our own friggin' governments and people that work with them to do this stuff. A lot of accounts are going to be zapped 100%. And Rumble, I'm concerned that with Dan Bongino, I hope you guys can hear me. yeah, anyway, leaving Rumble, that platform, he had a lot of viewers, a lot of popularity, and it may make Rumble less popular instead of more popular as we've wanted. And so I'm hoping that there are some other people that are as good as him, because he was a great podcaster, like very influential. I hope there's people that can step up and take that spot. I mean, no disrespect to who he's chosen, Evita. I've heard some of her content, and for me, it's just too Christian, almost over the top for me. And there's also a few other things like I don't really subscribe to, or like based on my research and my experiences, like I think that she's incorrect. And yeah, and anecdotal, a lot of anecdotal stuff as well, and maybe not the level of experience that she believes she has. And so I hope that there's someone else that can pull through for his show, so that, because he's been of service to his country, he's getting like a downgrade in pay and stuff like that. And you know, like he's losing all of his followers and supporters, and like that support he had on a daily basis, millions of people. And he's going to be bipartisan, not talking about politics anymore, because he can't. It's being a professional. And for me as well, I've said this, if I was to work on a government contract again, or within government or for them, like I would be bipartisan, obviously. And I feel like I try to be, even though I'm attacking certain political people and platforms. It's like I still see that there's good and bad in all the parties. And that's another thing as well. I'm going on these tangents, but because the snap election, an election might be happening in the next couple of months in Canada, I'm going to find out soon enough. It's hard to say this, because the last time I voted, I'm very honest with my voting, I voted for 3 different parties in my life, and it was based on the person and the platform. And so Maxime Bernier is someone that I voted for in 2021, and people were really pissed off at me, especially in my family. And there were people in my family who I love and respect. Some voted NDP, some voted Liberal, some voted Conservative, and a couple voted PPC, right? And we all got along. We all shared points about our platforms and the people. And then at the end of the day, we made our own decisions, and we still love each other and respect each other. And I still think they're really incredible people. So don't let that happen. But it was to also like a voting PPC at that time. It was to send a message to the Conservative Party, right? It wasn't that significant. It was, things were already being controlled, right? There was like not a lot that could have been done at that time anyways for the Conservative Party. And for them to get a majority government possibly in the next election, people were like, hey, you've got to like address these issues about COVID, about mandates, about immigration with like temporary foreign workers programs, and student visas being exploited, and our resources being exploited by people that are coming here without the intent to come for a better life. They're here to exploit us. And so these messages were by the vote, right? And so they did receive those messages. And even with Pierre, like he's been ratioed a couple of times on his social media because of posts that he's made regarding Trump, or regarding what's going on with our support for Ukraine and Israel. And I think he's listening, and he's open to listening. And whether it be politically motivated or not, like it is what it is, right? But the more people respectfully and peacefully that share information, spread the news, have uncomfortable conversations, but try to be respectful, because these are important. It's the only way forward, right? Unfortunately, they need the votes. They want the votes. They want to be popular. They want to be liked, right? And so if you can just like address key concerns that you have within the party that you want to vote for, maybe they'll change it, right? So like this left and right, all this division, when you don't. So I'm going to likely vote Conservative during this election, because I don't think I have a choice, right? Just like I said, if I was in the US right now, I would have voted for Trump, right? He was by far the better of both options, by far the better of both options, and the independent was never going to get the win anyways, right? And so the same thing in Canada, right? So between Carney, even saying that makes me like gash, stress, between Carney and Pierre, even saying it, Poilievre is absolutely the better candidate, like, by far. And yes, there are red flags with things I've already discussed and addressed, but I think that he could be willing, given pressure, peacefully, to be swayed differently. I hope this is all making sense. Carney is not an option for Canada. I have given so many videos as to why, and proven the level of corruption he's been involved in, and how he's more of a global elitist, not a nationalist. And I know that there's like a negative, connotation when people say that, but I would argue that the people that are the most dangerous to societies are people who are secular nationalists, people that don't believe there's a God of any sort, and communists. And it just is what it is. And this has been played against us in PSYOPs now for generations, and people keep on getting duped into believing it. Anyways, maybe I will. No, I was going to continue the video, but maybe I won't. But anyways, watch it if you haven't. And if not, I'll come back on maybe later on today or tomorrow if I have time. I do have guests coming, so I don't want to be rude. So on that note, I will leave it at that. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.